Hey everyone. Before we get into today's creepy story, I wanted to remind you this is my second channel. Be sure to subscribe here and check out my main channel for more scary stories. Most people watching these videos still aren't subscribed, so if that's you, please hit subscribe. It's free and helps out a lot. When my grandmother died, I was 25, and she left me her old house in suburban Detroit. My dad Tom and I were the only ones really dealing with the place. She passed in November, but all the paperwork and lawyer meetings took months, so the house sat empty for 3 months straight. We'd go over there every few weeks, sometimes to pick up boxes of her clothes, sometimes just to run the water so the pipes wouldn't freeze, stuff like that. The first few times, it was fine. The house still smelled like her, that sharp lavender and dust smell, and everything looked exactly how she'd left it. Crocheted blankets on the couch, her little plastic pill organizers by the phone, the fridge with half-empty ketchup and jelly jars. Nothing really out of place. About a month in, though, we started to notice weird little things. The kitchen cabinets would be left open when I knew I'd closed them. I'd ask my dad if he left the silverware drawer open, and he'd say, "I thought you did." Or we'd find the bathroom door shut tight when it was always left open before. I remember one time I came in after work, and the hallway runner rug was turned completely sideways, like someone had just spun it around and left it that way. Dad said maybe we just remembered it wrong. Or maybe the house was settling, floors shifting a little. But I'd lived there a lot growing up, and I never remembered things moving around on their own. The next week, the old armchair in the living room looked pushed out just a bit further from the wall. A stack of magazines was knocked over on the coffee table. Nothing huge. We kept telling each other we probably just didn't pay attention, or maybe the movers from the estate sale nudged something. Still, every time I walked in, the house felt off. Not scary, but like the air was heavier. A closed-up feeling, like after a storm. My dad kept saying, "It's just in your head, the place is empty," and I wanted to believe him. When I'd go to the basement to check the water heater, I'd sometimes get this weird feeling like I was interrupting something. The pull chain light would be swaying a little when I'd get down there, but I figured it was just the door slamming upstairs. I kept telling myself there was nothing wrong, but I started moving a little faster every time I had to go down there, just in case. One afternoon, we found the coat closet open, and 2 of my grandmother's old raincoats were hanging on different pegs than before. We'd boxed up most of her clothes by then, so it didn't make sense. My dad laughed it off, but I could tell he was getting annoyed too. He started double-checking the locks on all the doors every time we left. A few times I'd catch him just standing in the kitchen looking around like he was waiting for something to happen. Still, we both decided it was just the stress of everything. Dealing with her stuff, the funeral, all of it. I tried to ignore the knots in my stomach every time we went back. We kept going, every week or two, grabbing small things, packing boxes, tossing out expired food. The feeling never got better. If anything, it got worse. The fridge made odd clicks at night, the pipes banged louder, and I stopped wanting to go upstairs alone. But I didn't say anything. I figured it was grief and stress, nothing more. Now looking back, I should have trusted my instincts from the start. The signs were there. I just didn't want to see them. By the second month, these odd details started to get a little harder to brush off. I'd come in and smell faint cigarette smoke in the back bedroom. Nobody in our family smoked, not in the house, and the windows were always shut tight. Sometimes the mailbox would have the junk mail tossed out on the porch, like someone had rifled through it. Dad said it was probably the wind, but the papers were never scattered, just stacked in a messy pile. I kept a set of tools in the garage for when we needed them, just a little red box with a hammer, some pliers, duct tape. I started noticing the box wasn't always where I left it. Once I found it on the washing machine, open. Another time, it was under the workbench, and I knew I hadn't touched it, My dad shrugged, said maybe he'd moved it and forgot. But neither of us could remember using the tools at all. Things started missing. Nothing valuable, just little stuff. A flashlight, a pack of AA batteries, one of my old hoodies. The garbage can outside would be full, even though we weren't staying there and we never brought trash over. There was a plastic bag with half-eaten takeout in it. I almost threw up because it was fresh, not something from before Grandma passed. I told my dad, and he just stood in the kitchen looking at the takeout bag for a long time. Then he checked every window and door, even the back screen, to make sure they were locked. We both started wondering if someone had a key, or if maybe one of the neighbors was using the place. He said, "I'll talk to Bob next door. Maybe he's seen someone hanging around." But when he asked, Bob just said he hadn't noticed anything weird, just that the lights came on some nights when he thought the house should be empty. A week later, I walked in to find the living room couch had an old mismatched blanket thrown over the back, and a pillow, one that definitely didn't belong to Grandma. There were dirty dishes piled up in the sink, and a mug with coffee grounds dried to the bottom. It looked like someone had eaten there, maybe even slept on the couch. The smell in the air was different, a little sour and stale. My dad swore up and down he hadn't touched any of it. The fridge had a new empty milk carton in it, and a half-eaten sandwich that neither of us recognized. Some breadcrumbs were scattered on the counter. I stood there just staring at it, and my dad slammed the fridge shut and said, "That's it, we're getting cameras." He went out that day and bought a set of cheap security cameras from Home Depot. We set them up in the kitchen, the hallway, and at the back door. Dad called the local police and told them about the break-ins. They came, took a look around, asked if anything valuable was missing. We said no, not really. Just that someone was clearly coming and going. The officer told us, "Unless we catch someone inside, there's not much we can do. Keep the cameras running and call us if you get a video." He said it was probably a squatter, or maybe someone with an old spare key. He said sometimes these cases go unsolved for months. After we set up the cameras, nothing happened for a week. The house stayed quiet. No new dishes, no weird smells, nothing out of place. I checked the video footage every night, waiting for something to show up, but it was all empty rooms, all night long. My dad thought maybe whoever it was realized we'd caught on and left for good. Maybe they moved on to another empty house. We started to relax a little, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was just a pause, not the end. I started planning to do my own stakeout, just in case. I asked Sarah and Mika to help me stay overnight at my grandmother's house, since every time I went alone, I just kept thinking about that stranger maybe hiding inside. They were both pretty skeptical at first, but when I showed them the camera footage, mostly just empty rooms, but a weird shadow moving past the back door at 2 a.m. the week before, they got nervous enough to agree. Mika said if we found anything, at least there'd be 3 of us to handle it, and Sarah insisted we bring Rex, my old shepherd mix. He wasn't big, but he barked at anyone he didn't know and had a way of making people keep their distance. We planned it like an old-fashioned sleepover, but with baseball bats and a can of pepper spray each. It was April, still cold at night. The house was drafty and everything echoed, even with all 3 of us talking and laughing to keep our nerves down. Around 9 p.m., we realized none of us had brought real food, just snacks and soda. So we piled into Sarah's car and ran to the 7-Eleven 2 blocks over. We were gone maybe 20 minutes. When we came back, the porch light was on, which was normal. But as soon as we walked in, we could hear the TV in the living room. Some old game show was playing, the volume loud enough that we should have heard it outside. None of us had turned it on. Rex's hackles went straight up and he growled, low and steady, staring at the ceiling above the living room. I looked at the remote on the coffee table, right where I'd left it earlier. Mika whispered. Did we leave that on? But we all knew the answer. We stood still for a moment, waiting to see if there'd be more noise. That's when we heard it. Just a creak, but heavy, coming from the master bedroom upstairs. We froze. Rex barked, sharp and loud, and bolted to the base of the stairs, barking like crazy. I could hear my heart pounding. It was dead quiet for a few seconds, except for Rex, and then we all heard the footsteps. Slow, unsteady, but definitely someone up there trying to be quiet. Sarah's hands were shaking as she pulled out her phone and called 911. She gave them the address, her voice trembling but clear. Mika blocked the kitchen door to the backyard, and I stood by the front, just listening, waiting to see if someone would run. We could hear shuffling upstairs, a closet door slamming, then silence again. The dispatcher told us to stay put and not go upstairs. Just wait for the police. I held Rex's collar so he wouldn't charge up on his own. The footsteps moved again, a little faster now, like whoever it was realized they were trapped. It felt like forever, just waiting. I kept expecting to see someone's shadow at the top of the stairs. Every sound made me jump. Sarah kept checking the front window, watching for the patrol car. Finally, we saw the headlights. The cops showed up, 2 of them, coming in with flashlights and hands on their guns. They told us to stay outside. We listened as they moved from room to room, calling out warnings. I heard them in the attic, stomping around, even tapping on the walls. After 15 minutes, they came back down and said, "Nobody's here. All the doors and windows are still locked from the inside." They searched the yard, checked the garage. Nothing. One officer said maybe whoever it was jumped out a window before we got home. But there were no footprints in the wet dirt outside, and the ground under the windows was undisturbed. The cops left, telling us to call if anything else happened. I watched them go, feeling more confused than relieved. We all decided to stay up the rest of the night in the living room, Rex curled up between us. None of us slept. Every noise sounded like footsteps. Every gust of wind felt like someone moving around outside. By morning, we hadn't seen or heard anything else, and we tried to laugh it off, but nobody really could. A couple nights later, I went back by myself to grab some clothes I'd left. I found a note on the kitchen table, just a piece of notebook paper torn out, with words in messy black marker. "This is my home now." I didn't touch it, just took a picture and texted it to my dad. When I opened the pantry, some of the food we just restocked was missing. Cereal boxes gone, a loaf of bread half-eaten on the counter. The glass in my grandmother's china cabinet was smashed out, shards everywhere, her good plates gone. I felt like I was being watched every second I was in the house. I left after 5 minutes and drove straight to Sarah's, still clutching my keys in my fist. We called the police again. They came, wrote down the details, dusted for prints, but told us honestly that if we couldn't catch someone in the act, there wasn't much more they could do. They said they'd increase patrols, but warned us not to try staying overnight again. That week, 2 more notes appeared on the table, both in the same handwriting. "You don't belong here," and "Leave food." It was enough for me. I told my dad I was done, that I wasn't going back in there. He agreed. We got a real security company to come out. Motion sensors, cameras everywhere, door alarms with direct connection to the police. I still got notifications every night, little blips that said, "Motion detected in kitchen," or "Living room sensor tripped." But the cameras never caught anyone. Once, the footage showed the lights flicker on and off at 2 a.m., with nothing there, no sign of movement. Then, another note showed up. "Turn off the cameras." That was it for me. I called the realtor the next day and told her to list it. We lowered the price by 20 grand just to get rid of it. The house sold within 2 weeks. A young couple bought it and moved in right away, I kept waiting to hear something. Another call, a report of break-ins. But nothing ever happened again. The police closed the file, and that was it. Sometimes I wonder if the person was living in the walls, or the attic, or just knew the house better than we did. I think if we'd kept pushing, maybe we could have found them. But honestly, I'm glad we just walked away. Some people will fight for a place out of stubbornness or pride, but I wasn't about to risk my friends or myself for a house full of bad memories and an intruder who never wanted to leave. Some things you just have to let go. When I was 16, my parents and I went to my uncle's house for his birthday party. It was one of those evenings where everyone from the family showed up. The house wasn't anything fancy, just a ranch style with the same brown couch he'd had since I was a kid. We parked out front and I helped carry in a pan of lasagna my mom made. My uncle's friends were already in the living room, talking too loud. That's where I first saw Robert. He was sitting on the edge of the couch, beer in his hand, laughing at something my dad said. I remembered him from other family parties growing up, but we never talked much. He'd always been around, a friend from my dad's old job, but never anyone I thought twice about. That night, though, as soon as I walked in, he looked right at me and smiled like he was genuinely happy to see me. The party was just getting started, and people milled around, grabbing paper plates and drinks from the kitchen counter. I tried to keep busy helping my mom set out the food, but every time I turned around, Robert was close by. When dinner started, everyone took a seat at the long table in the dining room. There were barely enough chairs, so Robert pulled one up right next to mine. He started asking about school, what grade I was in, what classes I liked. I answered politely. He kept going, asking if I knew what I wanted to study in college, if I was thinking about living on campus or at home. At first, it felt like he was just being friendly, but his questions didn't stop. He asked if I had a job, if I ever went to parties, if I still talked to friends from elementary school. It felt like a job interview. I laughed off some of his questions, but he just kept smiling, nodding like he was really invested. When I finished eating, I started to clear my plate, hoping to escape the conversation. Robert immediately stood up and offered to help, grabbing my plate before I could protest. In the kitchen, I loaded the dishwasher. He stood a little too close, leaning in to keep talking. I could smell his cologne, sharp and cheap. He asked if I had any plans for the summer. I shrugged and said maybe a part-time job, maybe nothing. He smiled and said, "That's the best age. All the time in the world ahead of you." I didn't know what to say to that, so I focused on rinsing the plates. He stood there, not moving away, just talking. The conversation drifted to music, then to movies, but each topic seemed to circle back to me. He kept asking what I liked, if I was dating anyone, if my parents let me go out at night. After a while, I pretended I had to use the bathroom just to get away. He watched me go, still smiling, eyes following me down the hall. Back in the living room, the adults had started a card game and some cousins were watching TV. I sat with my phone, scrolling to look busy. Robert eventually came back out, standing behind the couch and watching the card game for a while. But after a few minutes, he drifted over to where I was sitting. He asked if I wanted dessert, and when I said no, he sat down beside me anyway, just a little too close. The rest of the night, he stayed nearby, always finding a reason to be right there. If I stood up, he stood up. If I went to talk to my mom, he followed, asking her how I was doing in school, making it sound like he was just being nice. But I felt watched the whole time, every movement tracked. When I tried to help clean up again, he was there, always quick to offer help. It started to feel like I couldn't move through the room without bumping into him. The whole thing was making me uneasy, but I didn't know how to say anything without sounding rude or weird. I told myself maybe I was just imagining it. He was my dad's friend after all. As the evening went on, Robert kept finding reasons to touch my shoulder or brush my arm when he talked to me. The first time, I didn't think much of it, but then it kept happening. He'd laugh at something I said and tap my arm, or squeeze my shoulder when he made a joke. Each touch felt casual, but there was something off about it. I wondered if anyone else noticed. I looked over at my dad and uncle, sitting at the kitchen table with a couple beers, talking about old times. My dad was facing our direction, but he didn't look up. Robert leaned in and said I looked nice in my dress. I mumbled thanks, but he just kept going, asking if I had a boyfriend. I said no. He smiled, slow and strange, then asked if I ever went to the movies or out to eat with friends. I shook my head. He started telling me about new restaurants in town, places he liked, and said I should try them sometime. He listed off a few, like he was making plans. I nodded along, not sure what else to do. He asked if I drove yet, if I had my license. I said I was still learning. He laughed and said, I could show you some good routes if your dad doesn't mind. The whole thing felt like a performance, but my dad didn't look up once. I started glancing his way, hoping he'd notice or say something, but he just kept talking to my uncle. I wondered if I was being too sensitive, if Robert was just being friendly in an awkward way, but every time he touched my arm or asked another question, my stomach twisted tighter. Robert kept describing places in town he thought I'd like, parks, coffee shops, acting like he was putting together an itinerary for us. The room felt smaller and smaller, every corner crowded. I caught my reflection in the kitchen window. My face looked normal, but I felt strange, like I was a guest in my own body. Eventually, I went to get a glass of water, trying to put some distance between us. Robert followed, right behind me. You know, you've really grown up, he said. Last time I saw you, you were just a kid. I just nodded, keeping my eyes on the sink. In the background, my dad and uncle's voices were getting louder, laughing about something from high school. I kept hoping my dad would call me over, say he needed help with something, but it never happened. Robert stood in the doorway, blocking the exit just enough that I had to squeeze past him to leave. I hurried out, pretending not to notice his hand brush my back. I wanted to find my mom, tell her I was tired, but she was busy helping my aunt with the cake. I checked my phone, looking for a reason to leave, but I knew my parents wouldn't be ready for another hour at least. I sat down at the table with my younger cousins, trying to blend in. But even then, Robert kept his eyes on me, always nearby, always listening to the conversation. Every time someone called my name, he'd answer for me, acting like he knew what I was going to say. The whole night, I watched the clock, counting down the minutes until we could go home. The worst moment of the night came after most people had started to leave, and only a few of us were hanging around the kitchen, picking at leftovers and saying our goodbyes. I was stacking paper plates in the trash when Robert walked up behind me, way too close, and said, "We should meet up sometime and really talk, without all this family chaos going on." He smiled, the same too slow, too long smile, and didn't look away. He said it like a secret, like there was something we both understood. I just nodded, mumbling something about being busy with school, and tried to slide around him, but he blocked my path a little. My heart was racing and my hands shook as I reached for the sink to rinse off. I didn't make eye contact, hoping he'd get bored and leave. But he just hovered there, leaning on the counter, talking softly about his favorite coffee shop, saying we could go sometime, just us. I told him I had too much homework, and he just smiled, like he didn't believe me. Even when my cousin came in to grab her purse, Robert didn't back away. I tried to keep the conversation with her going so I wouldn't be alone, but the second she left, he stepped in again. He kept following me around the party, not saying much but always nearby. If I sat down in the living room, he stood behind the couch. If I went to the hallway, he found a reason to walk past. It didn't matter where I was. If I was alone for even a second, he showed up. When other relatives tried to talk to me, he'd wait just out of earshot, like he was waiting for them to finish so he could come back. It got so bad that I started sticking close to my aunt and my female cousins. I made up excuses to help my aunt with cleaning or watch a movie with the little kids, just to have people around me at all times. I hoped he'd get the message, but he never really left me alone. A few times, when I went to the bathroom or stepped out onto the porch for a breath of air, he was there, pretending to look at his phone or have a cigarette, always glancing over. My phone buzzed in my pocket and I kept checking it, pretending I was texting someone, but it didn't matter. By the end of the night, I was counting the minutes until we could leave, rehearsing what I'd say if he tried to talk to me again. When it was finally time to say goodbye, my parents started gathering their things and calling me over to thank my uncle for dinner. I was putting on my shoes in the hallway when Robert appeared next to me. He smiled and opened his arms for a hug. We'd never hugged before. Usually we just waved or shook hands like everyone else. I didn't want to make a scene, so I hugged him quickly, but he held on tight, both arms wrapped around me like he wasn't going to let go. It was too long, too close, and I could feel his breath on my neck. He whispered, "Don't forget what I said about getting together," right in my ear, his hand pressing gently into my back. I pulled away as quickly as I could, avoiding his eyes. My dad was standing nearby, watching the whole thing, but he just nodded at Robert and didn't say a word. I felt my face burning and I hurried over to my mom, hoping no one else had noticed how long the hug lasted. On the drive home, I kept waiting for my dad to bring it up, to ask if Robert had said anything weird or made me uncomfortable. Instead, he started talking about work, complaining about a coworker, and then asked me if I had any homework to finish before Monday. My mom scrolled through her phone, making plans for the next week. I stared out the window, thinking about what I'd say if he ever asked, but he never did. I realized either he didn't notice how Robert acted, or he saw and didn't care enough to do anything. That was almost worse than the hug itself. Knowing the people who were supposed to protect me just let it happen. I didn't sleep much that night, replaying the whole evening in my head, wondering if I'd done something wrong or if I should have said something out loud. The next week at school, I told a couple of my friends what happened. They all agreed Robert's behavior wasn't normal and told me I should talk to my mom or dad about it. I knew they were right, but the thought of causing drama in the family made me feel sick. We only saw Robert at big family gatherings, maybe twice a year. I told myself I could handle it. I was leaving for college in another state in a few months anyway, and I'd just make sure to never be alone with him again. I started thinking about excuses I could use if he ever tried to talk to me in private, ways to slip away if he cornered me again. I kept my distance at every family event after that, always sitting near my cousins or helping my aunt with food so I had people around me. 2 years have gone by since that night. I still see Robert at holidays or parties, but I'm better at shutting down conversations before they get weird. If he tries to talk to me alone, I just excuse myself, say I need to help with something or answer a call. He still tries sometimes, but it never goes anywhere. I never told my parents exactly how bad it felt, but I know now I was right to trust my gut. Just because someone is a family friend doesn't mean they're safe. The whole thing taught me that adults don't always protect kids the way they should, even when the warning signs are obvious. Sometimes you have to protect yourself, even when you're hoping someone else will step in. When I was 25 and in medical school, I picked up extra shifts at the hospital to help with tuition. Most nights, I didn't mind it. The halls were mostly quiet after midnight. The staff just focused on getting through till morning. But I always hated the commute home. My car had been in the shop for almost a week, so I had to use the city bus if I finished late. That Tuesday night, I got off at 2:45 a.m., and it was one of those shifts where you leave feeling like your brain is running on fumes. I walked out through the ambulance entrance and cut across the parking lot, feeling the cold in my scrubs. There's not much around the hospital, just an old liquor store, a payday loan place, and a couple of empty buildings. I checked the bus schedule on my phone and saw I had maybe 15 minutes before the last bus rolled through. The stop was down near the corner, under a flickering streetlight that didn't do much to cut the shadows. It always felt sketchy over there at night. Almost no cars, and nobody around except maybe someone sleeping in the doorway of the liquor store. My shoes stuck to the sidewalk a little from spilled soda or who knows what, and I kept one hand on my backpack strap just out of habit. I was the only person waiting. I kept glancing at my phone, thinking about putting on some music, but the empty street made me uneasy enough that I wanted to keep my ears open. I saw someone across the street at the bus shelter, but she was walking my way, fast at first, then slower when she got close. She looked about mid-40s, with frizzy hair and layers of wrinkled clothes like she'd been sleeping rough or hadn't changed in a few days. There was something about how she moved, arms tight to her body, eyes darting around the sidewalk, made me think she was coming down from something, or maybe just hadn't slept. Before I could put in my headphones, she was already talking, real casual like she knew me. "Hey, you working the night shift too?" she said. Her voice was scratchy, and her words sort of blurred together. I gave a short nod, trying not to sound unfriendly, and shifted a few steps back so I had a little space between us and the street. She didn't seem to notice. She started rambling right away, telling me about how she used to work at the hospital before everything changed, but she didn't say what she meant by that. She had a plastic bag with her, the kind you get from gas stations, half torn and crammed with stuff. Every time she spoke, she swayed a little on her feet. I glanced up and down the block to make sure nobody else was coming. The way her eyes kept moving reminded me of some of the psych patients we got on the unit, never settling on one thing for more than a few seconds. Her face was drawn, and when she smiled, it was more like a twitch. She seemed to be looking past me half the time, talking at the air. They don't let me see my daughter anymore, you know. That's the worst part. She's still in school, but those people, they follow her, watch her, wait outside. I tried to keep my distance without making it obvious. I know it's better not to provoke someone who's already agitated, especially at night, so I just nodded along and hoped the bus would come early for once. The conversation shifted and never stayed on one topic. She started telling me about her neighbors spying on her, peeking through the windows, writing down when she left the house. She said someone from upstairs had tried to break into her place, with a key the landlord gave them. But when I asked if she was okay now, she just laughed, a rough sound. They want to get me out. They say I'm crazy, but they're the ones doing it. She dug around in her big shoulder bag, pulling out a squashed pack of cigarettes, but never actually lighting one. Her hands were shaking, either from the cold or maybe something else. She kept dropping things and picking them up, an empty lighter, a plastic comb, a pack of tissues that fell apart in her fingers. The street was quiet except for the hum of the traffic light changing back and forth, even though there were no cars. I checked my phone again, pretending I was just looking at the time, but really trying to see how many minutes were left. She caught me glancing and moved a bit closer, lowering her voice. "There's bad people in this neighborhood. They watch everything. They know where you go. You gotta keep moving." I tried to look sympathetic but non-committal, but it only seemed to make her talk faster. "They come at night, you know. They wait. My landlord said I could stay. But then he started sending letters, saying I had to leave. He thinks I don't see him watching me through the blinds. She was getting louder now, waving her hand around as if to show me invisible proof. It's not safe out here. People think you're paranoid, but they don't know. She fumbled in her bag again, still searching for that cigarette, then finally gave up and shoved the bag under her arm. Her gaze flicked past me, down the street, and she started repeating, "You gotta keep moving. Don't let them see you stand still." At this point, I was getting more nervous than before, glancing for headlights or any sign of the bus. Her behavior was unpredictable, and even though she wasn't being directly aggressive, I could feel tension building just from how frantic her movements were getting. I hoped she would wander off before the bus came, but she stayed right there, eyes on me, muttering about the bad people, her landlord, and the police being in on it. I kept one eye on the street and one on her, shifting my weight from foot to foot, counting every second until those bus headlights finally turned the corner. When she reached into her bag for the third time, a kitchen knife slipped out and clattered onto the pavement between us. It wasn't huge, maybe 6 inches, but the blade caught the yellow from the streetlight and looked sharp enough to make my chest tighten. I automatically took 2 steps back. My hands were up before I even thought about it, just a reflex from too many hours in the ER with people who brought in all kinds of weapons. She didn't look surprised at all. She just bent down and picked it up, like she'd dropped her keys. She held the knife loose in her hand, glancing at me like she wanted to see if I was scared. Then she smiled in that twitchy, uneven way and said, "Gotta keep something on you out here. Can't trust anybody after dark." Her voice dropped low, almost a whisper. "Too many bad people. They follow you." Then she slipped the knife back into her bag, but now she kept her hand right near the opening, thumb tracing the edge of the handle through the fabric. I nodded and made sure there was plenty of space between us. My mind started racing. The hospital entrance was less than a block away, but there was nothing between us except open sidewalk. I looked at the empty street, hoping a car would pass, but there was just the steady hum of the traffic light and the click of her bag zipper. I checked my phone again, pretending I was just bored, but I was really calculating if I could make it back to the ER before she could do anything. The bus should have arrived in 5 minutes, but it already felt late. My hands felt clammy. She must have noticed how tense I got, because she gave me this sharp look and said, "Relax, I'm not after you. It's the others I'm worried about." She started up her story again as if nothing had happened. Her voice was softer now, the words coming in waves, jumping from one thing to the next. She talked about her sister in another city, about how the government took her money, about her ex-husband who sent people to follow her. Every few seconds she'd pat the side of her bag, fingers brushing the outline of the knife, checking it was still there. I forced myself to just nod along, keeping my voice steady, saying, "Yeah," or "That's tough," whenever she paused long enough for me to say anything at all. I didn't want to make her angry, but I didn't want her to feel too comfortable either. I kept my body angled slightly away from her, facing the street, ready to move if I had to. The wind picked up and rattled an empty soda can down the gutter. I could finally see the glare of the bus headlights rounding the corner, bouncing off the glass of the payday loan shop. Relief spread through my chest, but I kept my eyes on her. She followed my gaze, then took a step back from the curb. I tried not to show how eager I was to leave, but my feet were already shifting forward. The brakes hissed as the bus came to a stop, and the door opened with that familiar tired groan. I expected her to get on with me. She'd been standing there just as long, and people usually want out of that neighborhood after dark. Instead, she turned and said, almost as if she remembered something urgent, "No, I got stuff to do. Can't leave tonight. Too much happening." She started down the street, bag tight to her side, still talking to herself about people watching her windows. I climbed onto the bus, holding my backpack against my chest, and looked back to see her disappearing into the shadows, muttering, head down, knife hidden again. The driver didn't even look up, just waited for me to tap my card, and then pulled away from the curb. The bright fluorescent lights inside the bus made me blink. There were 2 other passengers, both with their heads down, lost in their own problems. I picked a seat near the middle and pressed my forehead to the glass, watching the city roll past. My heart was still pounding, the images replaying in my mind, the glint of the knife, the way her hand never left her bag, how easily things could have gone wrong if she'd felt threatened or if I'd said the wrong thing. I never saw her again. I started planning every trip home more carefully after that, even though it made me feel paranoid. I walked different routes, chose better lit stops, sometimes paid for a rideshare if I could afford it, even if it meant eating cheap instant noodles for a week. If my shift ended too late, I'd stay in the resident lounge and sleep on a couch. The whole thing stuck with me, not just the fear, but the sense of how close things can come to going sideways. I'd seen a lot of people in bad situations, but it was different when you were alone on the street and there was no one else around. You learn fast that most people on the edge aren't looking to hurt anyone, but when you add in desperation, drugs, or mental illness, it gets unpredictable. After that night, I paid more attention to everyone around me at the hospital, not just the patients. I started to see the signs, the twitchy hands, the talking to themselves, the wary glances at every stranger. I knew the woman probably needed help, not suspicion or fear. She was just trying to survive in a city that chews people up and spits them out, where even a bus stop feels like a risk. But at the time, all I could think was how lucky I was that the bus came when it did, and that she decided to walk away. Sometimes just getting home in one piece is the best outcome you can hope for. When I was 16, I started going to this hair salon called Golden Locks on Main Street for color and styling. The first time I walked in, it was raining outside and the place smelled like bleach and expensive shampoo. I remember the yellow sign in the window and the little bell on the door that jingled every time someone came in. The owner, Rosa, was a short woman with dark, shiny hair and big earrings. She smiled at me right away, said, "You must be our new client," and took my coat like I was someone important. Her assistant, Carmen, was younger, probably in her 20s, and she wore bright nail polish and tight jeans under her apron. They worked together easily, chatting as they mixed dye and washed hair, sometimes slipping into Spanish when they thought I wasn't listening. At first, I felt lucky that they paid attention to me. Rosa asked me where I went to school, what I wanted to do when I graduated, and even what subjects I liked best. She made comments about how mature I was for my age, and how it was so nice to have a young client who carried herself well. Carmen always agreed, laughing and calling me Chica, and asking if I needed anything to drink. It was kind of flattering, especially since my parents hardly ever asked about my life. After a couple appointments, Rosa started giving me discounts, taking $10 or $20 off the total, and saying it was because I was her favorite. Sometimes she'd do extra treatments, deep conditioner, special oil for split ends, without charging me, making a big show of it in front of the other customers. "For you, special," she'd say, smiling at me in the mirror. Rosa talked about my future a lot, saying I was destined to be successful. She told me I was so much smarter than the other girls my age, and that I would go far if I just kept making good choices. Carmen would nod and say, "You'll meet the right people, you'll see." Sometimes Rosa would run her hands through my hair and say I reminded her of her own daughter, who was studying in another state. It was strange, but I didn't question it back then. I liked the way they treated me. They always seemed happy to see me, making sure to book my next appointment before I left, telling me not to worry about the price, just to keep coming back. They always asked when my parents would be picking me up, or if I was walking home, making sure I got out of the salon safely. Looking back, I realize how much attention they gave to things that weren't really their business, but at the time, I just thought they cared. After a few months of regular appointments, things started to change a little. Rosa would wait until no one else was in the salon before asking me more personal questions. One afternoon, she asked if I had a boyfriend. I told her no, and she frowned a little, like she was disappointed. She said, "You're very pretty, you know. You must have lots of boys interested in you." Carmen chimed in from the back room. "She's just picky, that's all." I shrugged, but Rosa kept pushing, wanting to know if I'd ever been on a date, what kind of boys I liked, if I wanted to get married someday. It felt weird, but I answered as simply as I could. That's when Rosa started talking about her nephew, Diego. She said he was a mechanic, very responsible, working long hours, and looking for a nice girl to settle down with. She showed me a picture on her phone. He looked maybe in his late 20s, older than anyone I'd ever dated, and had a beard and tattoos on his arms. Rosa smiled and told me he was a good man, always helping the family, and that he just hadn't found the right person yet. When I told her I was only 16, she laughed and said, Age is just a number. You're more mature than most girls your age anyway. Diego needs someone with a good head on her shoulders." I tried to joke it off, but she started mentioning him at every appointment after that. Every time I sat in the chair, Rosa would bring Diego up, how he was saving money for a house, how he wanted a serious relationship, how he would take care of a good girl. Carmen started joining in too, telling me about another girl she knew who met Diego and now had a nice job in another city because he helped her get on her feet. They kept saying how life could be better for me, how Diego could help me with anything I needed, even get me a better phone or help me travel. The whole thing felt off, but they never said anything openly bad, just little comments mixed in with the usual salon talk. After that, the pressure started to build. Rosa would say, "He asked about you again," and tell me to let her know if I wanted to meet him. Carmen would say, "Don't let a good man get away, chica." It was never aggressive, just constant. If I hesitated, they'd tell me I was too young to understand how hard life could be, that people like Diego didn't come around often. I started to dread going to my appointments, but Rosa would text me reminders, saying she saved a spot for me, or that she had a new product to try just for me. I'd get messages on my phone from Carmen, telling me not to forget my touch-up, that Rosa would be upset if I canceled last minute. Even when I tried to change the subject, they'd steer the conversation back to Diego, or make comments about how girls my age never appreciated opportunities until it was too late. One afternoon after school, as I sat in the chair waiting for the dye to set, Rosa leaned in close, speaking quietly so the other client wouldn't hear. "You should let me introduce you to Diego," she said. "He can really help you. Trust me, it's for your own good." Carmen stood behind us, sweeping up hair, nodding. "She's right. You never know what could happen. Diego's family. He'll take care of you." I stared at my phone, pretending to text, while Rosa kept her hand on my shoulder, squeezing just a little too hard. I looked up in the mirror and saw her watching me in the glass, waiting for an answer. Over the next year and a half, the conversations about Diego never really stopped. At first, I'd try to switch topics or just nod along, but Rosa and Carmen always circled back. Rosa would tell me that high school was a waste of time for a smart girl like me, that I'd be better off starting my adult life sooner. She'd say things like, "You're stuck here, you're too good for this little town." Sometimes, while she trimmed my ends, she'd tell stories about women who made a new start in a big city and how Diego helped them get settled. Carmen always agreed, saying she knew girls who moved to Miami or LA, got good jobs, and never looked back. Rosa would lean in close and say, "You could be like them if you wanted. Diego can help you." If I said I wasn't interested, their faces would drop. I'd get the cold shoulder, my haircut done in silence, or Rosa would tell Carmen in Spanish that I was throwing away my chance. It got so that I'd dread the last 10 minutes of every appointment, waiting for the pitch. But then, after a few weeks, they'd go back to being friendly, offering discounts again, making me feel welcome, and I'd relax, thinking maybe they finally let it go. I told myself I was overreacting, that maybe this was just their way of helping. But every time, they'd bring Diego up again, asking if I was ready to meet someone serious, someone who could take care of a girl like me. I started skipping some appointments, but I always came back eventually. They were good at what they did, and I liked how I looked when I left the salon. Part of me wanted to believe their attention was harmless. It was routine now, and I'd grown used to it, convincing myself I'd know if anything was really wrong. On my 18th birthday, I decided I deserved a treat and made an appointment at Golden Locks for a keratin treatment. I remember the air felt heavy that day, the usual smell of shampoo mixed with something sweeter, almost like perfume. When I got there, Rosa greeted me with her usual big hug and congratulations. But instead of taking me straight to a chair, she led me to the back room, saying she had a surprise. Diego was sitting in one of the stylist's chairs, scrolling on his phone. In person, he looked older than his photos. Deeper lines on his face, a big watch on his wrist, and that same tattoo on his hand. He stood up and shook my hand, holding on a little too long. Rosa and Carmen said they needed to pick up some supplies, leaving me alone with him. Diego started talking right away. He asked if my parents still lived nearby and if I had a boyfriend now that I was an adult. Then he wanted to know if I worked, if I had savings, if anyone would miss me if I left town for a while. He kept talking about Miami, Los Angeles, New York, listing off jobs and places to stay, all as if I'd already agreed. He kept saying I'd be safer if I left my old life behind, that he could show me a new world. I just nodded, feeling trapped, watching the clock on the wall. When my treatment was done, I grabbed my bag and tried to walk out fast, but Diego was already at the door, insisting on walking me to my car. "It's not safe out there," he said, trying to sound friendly, but it felt more like a threat. Outside, the parking lot was half empty. The sun was already going down. I said I was fine, that I could make it to my car, but Diego didn't listen. He kept a hand on my arm, steering me past the other parked cars toward a white van with no windows. He told me, "It's time to start your new life. Rosa already packed some things for you. We can leave right now." His grip tightened on my wrist, and I saw the van's back doors were cracked open, a duffel bag I recognized from the salon sitting inside. My heart pounded. I tried to pull away, but he squeezed harder, telling me to be quiet, that everything was going to be fine if I just listened. That's when I realized how stupid I'd been, coming back here after all the warnings. The salon, the offers, the stories about other girls, the way they tracked my appointments and asked about my family. It was all part of something bigger. This was the moment they'd been planning, waiting for me to turn 18, waiting until no one could call it kidnapping a minor. I screamed as loud as I could, pushing back and twisting my wrist. Diego tried to cover my mouth, but I kept yelling, using every bit of strength I had. I heard footsteps pounding on the pavement, a security guard in a blue jacket running toward us, waving his arms and shouting. Diego let go so suddenly I almost fell. He turned and tried to laugh it off, telling the guard we were just talking. I stepped away from him, shaking, holding my keys between my fingers like claws. The guard put himself between us and asked me if I was okay, if this man was bothering me. I nodded, unable to say much, my mouth dry and hands shaking. Diego shrugged, put his hands up, and walked away from the van, pretending nothing was wrong. The guard asked if I needed help, and when I said yes, he walked me the rest of the way to my car, making sure I got in and locked the door before he left. I drove home with my hands shaking, barely able to hold the wheel. I called my mom and told her everything. Then I called the police. They listened, but said there wasn't enough evidence for an arrest unless something more happened. They took my statement and told me to stay away from the salon, to let them know if I saw Diego or the white van again. I never went back to Golden Locks. I blocked Rosa and Carmen's numbers, deleted every message, threw out every bottle of shampoo I'd bought there. Sometimes I see stories on the news about girls going missing, about trafficking, and I wonder how many times things like this have happened to others. They spend months, years even, building trust, finding girls who feel alone, making them think they're special, all so they can take them the moment no one is looking. I got away, but I think about it all the time. I think about what would have happened if the guard hadn't been there, or if I hadn't screamed, or if I'd gotten in that van. And I know now, it was never just about hair. When I was 23, I got really into urban decay photography. Detroit is full of these places, but I kept hearing about this old textile factory out past the main city streets, not far from a strip of closed warehouses and the old train line. I'd seen some shots online and figured it would be worth the drive. Saturday afternoon, I packed up my camera, 2 lenses, a little tripod, and a flashlight. I threw on an old jacket because the forecast called for rain later and headed out. My car rattled on the cracked roads, past empty lots and rusted fences, until I found the building. The factory took up nearly a whole block, 4 stories tall, with faded brick walls and dirty windows. Ivy crawled up one whole side, wrapping the corners and disappearing inside through a busted pane on the 2nd floor. There was a sign that had fallen halfway off. Whitman Textiles, letters mostly missing now. The main doors were covered in plywood and metal bars. I circled the building, boots crunching over broken glass, looking for a way in. Down a side alley, between piles of old pallets and weeds, I saw a door hanging loose on its hinges. I pushed it, and it creaked open, groaning against the debris on the floor. The air inside was stale and cold. My first steps echoed. Just me. The noise bouncing off concrete walls and pillars. Inside was darker than I expected. I clicked on my flashlight, the beam cutting through dust and catching little flakes drifting down from the ceiling. Some old safety posters still clung to the wall by the entrance. Wear your helmet. Report all accidents. Most of the floor tiles were missing. Water dripped in a corner. Puddles spread under the exposed roof where daylight streamed through a ragged hole. In some places, insulation dangled in sheets like yellow spiderwebs. I started taking pictures right away, focusing on the lines of light crossing the main hall and the way the dust hung in the beams. Pipes ran along the walls, some dripping, all rusty. I stepped over old blueprints and a pile of rotting work gloves. The silence was heavy, broken only by my footsteps and the soft click of the camera shutter. I worked my way deeper into the factory. Each room looked different. The paint peeled in wide strips, green and white layers curling off. In one office, the ceiling tiles had collapsed, carpeting the floor with moldy chunks and bits of wire. There were chairs tipped over, desks with old paperwork still scattered on top. I snapped photos of broken phones, a shattered clock, an overturned metal cabinet with its drawers spilling out faded manila folders. The deeper I went, the less light there was, but in a few spots the sun angled through broken windows, making everything glow orange and gold. I wandered through narrow hallways lined with lockers and machinery, stopping every so often to take detailed shots of rusted bolts and tangled cords. I tried not to touch anything. The dust was thick, and the floor crunched under my shoes. In one corner of the main hall, someone had set up a pile of burned trash, now just blackened cans and a melted plastic bucket. The graffiti was everywhere, mostly tags, a few strange symbols I didn't recognize. Every so often I'd pause to listen, expecting the silence to break, but it didn't. I found the old production floor by following the tracks of a conveyor belt that ran the length of the main hall. The space opened up wide, with tall support beams running the full length and massive windows on one side, most of them broken out, letting in cold air and the smell of wet concrete. There were still big machines here, hulking in the shadows, belts and gears rusted solid. I set up my tripod to get a shot of the whole room, trying to frame the empty space and the lines of debris. The place felt like it had been frozen mid-collapse. I changed lenses, moving closer to the machines. I brushed away some dirt from a metal plate to read the serial number, then turned back to catch the light hitting an old spool rack. While I adjusted the focus, I heard something. A faint scrape that didn't fit with the noise of my own movement. I paused, holding my breath, listening, but heard nothing else. I shook it off, chalking it up to debris falling from somewhere up above. There were enough holes in the roof after all, and pigeons could get in. I crouched to take some low shots along the conveyor track, focusing on a chain that was almost fused to the floor with rust. As I stood up, dust drifted down from the rafters and the air smelled sharp, like old oil. I glanced around, flashlight beams sliding over the walls and floor. My shadow stretched huge and weird across the broken tiles. Still nothing but silence. I worked my way around the room, getting closer to the windows for more shots. I climbed over a pile of busted crates, careful not to slip. After about 20 minutes in that main hall, I started to feel more relaxed, falling into a rhythm with the photography. I stopped paying so much attention to the sounds and just moved from one interesting corner to another. My camera battery held steady at 2 bars. I glanced at my phone. No signal, which wasn't a surprise, but the time showed just past 3. I figured I'd stay another hour and maybe check out the upper floors if I could find a sturdy staircase. I was moving my tripod to the far end of the hall, trying to get a shot of the far wall, when I heard footsteps. Not mine, not echoing, but real, and coming from somewhere deeper inside the building. They were slow, spaced out, careful. Not the kind of steps you make when you're wandering, but like someone was trying not to be noticed. I froze, my hand tightening on my flashlight. The sound stopped as soon as I stopped moving. I called out, "Hey there!" trying to sound casual but loud enough to carry. My voice bounced off the walls and then faded. Nothing. No answer. For a moment, all I heard was water dripping again. I waited a few seconds, listening, but there was only silence now. I started to wonder if maybe it was another photographer, or a squatter, or possibly a security guard who hadn't expected anyone to come in today. I stayed where I was, still as possible, hoping for another sound or a response, but it stayed quiet. After a minute or two, I relaxed a bit, figuring whoever it was must have left through another exit when they heard me. I kept shooting for a bit, but my nerves were up. I glanced over my shoulder every few minutes. After maybe 10 more minutes, I packed up my tripod and decided to check out the upstairs. I found a metal stairwell off the back of the main hall, each step booming under my weight. The second floor was different, a little brighter from broken windows at both ends. More graffiti, more debris. A long row of rusted machines bolted to the floor, their belts sagging and cracked. I set my camera bag down and started lining up new shots. The sun had shifted, and the light was streaming in at an angle, catching the dust in the air and lighting up the corners. I was focused completely on getting the right exposure, crouched down to frame a row of gears in the late afternoon sun. That's when I heard the footsteps again, but this time they were accompanied by something that made my blood run cold. It was laughter, a low, raspy chuckle that didn't sound right at all. Not the kind of laugh you'd hear from someone exploring, joking around, or finding something funny. It was deeper, slower, almost like someone was choking on their own spit. I froze, every muscle in my body locked, and listened. The laughter came from the floor directly below me, echoing up through the broken beams and the gaps in the ruined ceiling. It lasted longer the second time, stretching out, then breaking off with a sudden cough. I stood there holding my breath, the camera still in my hands, and I realized whoever was down there had been listening to me walk, and they wanted me to know they were there. It was clear I wasn't alone in the factory, and this person wasn't trying to hide. They wanted me to feel uncomfortable. I tried to pinpoint exactly where the sound was coming from, but it bounced around the concrete, making it hard to tell if they were moving closer or just standing still, watching me. For a minute I just stood in the middle of that old room, unsure what to do next. My first thought was maybe I could wait them out, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this person wanted something from me, or at the very least, wanted to mess with me. I tried to go back to taking pictures, but my hands were shaking too much, and I kept glancing over my shoulder. The laughter faded, but now there were small scraping sounds, footsteps circling under my feet. It felt like they were tracing my route from below, step for step. I packed my lens back into the bag, snapped the buckles shut, and listened again. The building creaked and settled, but I could hear the footsteps changing direction, coming up toward the main stairwell. That's when I knew I needed to leave, and fast. I tried to keep calm and move toward the stairwell. As I passed the far end of the room, I caught a flicker of movement near one of the boarded-up windows. It looked like a shadow at first, just a break in the light, but then I saw it, an eye, watching me through a crack between two wooden planks. The eye didn't blink. It was wide and glassy, so focused it didn't even look real at first. For a second I thought maybe it was a trick of the light, but then the pupil shifted, following me as I walked. The eye stayed locked on me, unblinking, just waiting to see what I would do. My skin went cold and I gripped my bag tighter, slowly backing away from the window, never taking my eyes off that staring shape. The person didn't say a word. I heard them shifting behind the boards, like they were trying to keep me in sight, shuffling along the inside of the wall. My heart hammered as I ducked out of sight, moving quickly, but as quietly as I could. I stayed low, keeping one hand on my bag and the other holding my phone, even though I knew I had no service. As I reached the stairwell, I stopped and listened again. The footsteps had started up in another part of the building. It sounded like they were coming toward me, maybe from the hallway that led to the ground floor. I swallowed and started down the stairs, my boots crunching on the loose debris, trying not to trip. Every few steps I checked behind me, half expecting that staring eye to be waiting at the top of the landing. But it wasn't. Instead, I heard the heavy, slow tread of feet coming up from the opposite direction, then stopping. Whoever it was, they were listening too. I made it to the bottom of the stairs, and just as I turned the corner to the exit, I heard a door slam somewhere deeper in the factory. The echo was so loud it made me flinch. I didn't hesitate. I walked as fast as I could without breaking into a run, passing through the shadows and pushing open the same door I'd come in. As I stepped outside, I heard footsteps behind me again, this time moving faster, but not running. It was the sound of someone following, maybe 20 or 30 feet behind, just close enough to let me know they were there. I didn't look back until I was out in the alley, the sunlight hitting me in the face. I didn't see anyone in the doorway, but I could feel them watching. I sprinted the last stretch to my car, threw my camera gear in the passenger seat, and slammed the door shut. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped my keys. The engine turned over with a grinding noise that made me curse under my breath. As soon as it caught, I peeled out of the alley, tires skidding on gravel. I didn't slow down until I was a few blocks away, weaving through empty streets and past boarded-up houses. I checked my rearview mirror a dozen times, but nobody was following. I pulled over once I felt safe, just to catch my breath. A few days went by before I told anyone what happened. I brought it up to a friend who lived not far from the factory. He listened without saying much, then told me he wasn't surprised. That building, he said, was known as a crash pad for some of the roughest people in the area. People who'd been homeless or addicted for years, who had nowhere else to go. Some of them had made that place their home. They looked out for each other and saw anyone who came in as a threat, or at best, as someone to mess with. He told me there had been stories about trespassers getting jumped, robbed, even stabbed. The cops didn't patrol there unless someone called in a gunshot or a fire. It was basically a no-go zone after dark, and even during the day you were taking a risk if you wandered in alone. I never went back to that factory. I deleted most of the photos from my camera, except for a few shots of the empty halls and broken windows. Every time I thought about going back for more pictures, I remembered the sound of that laughter and the way that eyes stared through the boards, and I lost all interest. Sometimes, the scariest places aren't haunted by ghosts or shadows. It's the people who have nothing left to lose, who see you as nothing but a trespasser in their territory. I got lucky. I trusted my instincts and got out. That's not something I ever want to test again. Last summer when I was 20, my roommate Katie invited me to spend a weekend at her family's ranch out in the foothills. I said yes, because I'd never been out there before, and she promised it was peaceful, with lots of space to just get away from everything. We loaded her little sedan with our backpacks, some snacks, and a couple bags of groceries, then drove almost 2 hours out of the city. The ranch was even more isolated than I expected, just a long gravel road, fenced pastures, and a big house surrounded by nothing but hills and thick lines of trees in every direction. There weren't even any streetlights for miles. Katie's parents had left early that morning to go to some local fair a few towns over, and her little brother was away at camp. That meant it was just us in the house, with nobody around if anything went wrong. But at the time, I barely thought about that. We dumped our stuff in her room, then she gave me a quick tour. Big kitchen, a living room with high ceilings, 3 bedrooms down the hall, then a mudroom with boots and coats, and the back porch that looked out over the empty fields. The sun was blazing that day, so we decided to go for a walk along the fence line. The grass was dry and brittle, and our shoes kicked up clouds of dust as we went. A few cows watched us from a distance but didn't come close. We wandered for almost 2 hours, getting sunburned and taking dumb selfies until the heat finally drove us back inside. We made a simple dinner, pasta, salad, and some garlic bread, then sat around the kitchen table, talking about random stuff from school and watching the sky turn orange through the windows. After we cleaned up, Katie set up her laptop in the living room so we could watch movies on the big TV. The house felt totally quiet and safe. I remember thinking it was the most relaxed I'd felt in a long time. There was no signal, so our phones were basically just cameras and flashlights. It was honestly kind of nice. When it got dark, we locked the doors and turned on a few lights. We watched a couple comedies and a bad horror movie, then started getting ready for bed around 10. Katie made tea, and I stood at the window, looking out at the yard. It was so dark outside, I couldn't see anything past the porch. The house creaked sometimes, but nothing seemed off. There were no cars on the road, no neighbors' lights, just the sound of insects outside and the old fridge humming in the kitchen. I was about to brush my teeth when I realized how far we really were from anyone else. The nearest neighbor was apparently a rancher about 6 miles down the main road. If anything happened, it would be just the two of us. That thought made me a little uneasy, but Katie just laughed when I brought it up, saying, "That's the whole point, right? No one to bother us out here." We both changed into pajamas and brought our mugs back to the living room, sitting with our feet up on the coffee table and scrolling through pictures on her laptop. Around 10, we heard a sound, a dull, solid knock at the front door. At first, we just stared at each other. I figured maybe it was the wind or a branch hitting the porch. But then it came again, louder this time. 3 sharp knocks, very clear. Katie muted the TV. We sat totally still, listening. The house was old and made a lot of random noises, but this was different. I stood up and went over to the entryway, motioning for Katie to stay back. She followed me anyway, whispering, "Who the hell would come out here this late?" I turned on the porch light and looked through the peephole. There was a man standing on the mat. He looked maybe mid-40s, wearing a faded flannel shirt and dirty jeans, with a baseball cap pulled low. He didn't look like someone from around here, but I had no idea what the ranchers nearby were supposed to look like anyway. He was looking past the door, like he was trying to see inside, and kept shifting his weight from foot to foot. His pickup wasn't in the driveway, at least as far as I could see. That bothered me. Katie whispered, "Do you know him?" I shook my head and stepped back. She went to the door and kept the chain on, just cracking it an inch. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice shaky. The man leaned forward, squinting through the gap. "Hey, sorry to bother you girls. My truck broke down a ways up the road, maybe 15 miles back. I've been walking a while. Just need to use your phone to call a tow." He sounded calm but impatient, almost like he was annoyed that she wasn't just letting him in. He kept glancing past her into the house, eyes darting around the living room and up the stairs. He smelled like sweat and engine oil. Katie pulled her cell out of her pocket and offered it through the crack. "You can use mine. Just tell me the number." The man shook his head. "No, I need to come in and use your landline. My hands are freezing. Please, it's important." Something about the way he said it, the insistence, put me on edge. Katie said, "It's fine. The cell works. I'll dial for you if you want." He frowned, not even pretending to reach for the phone. He started looking around again, peering at the side of the house, his eyes flickering back to the kitchen where our bags were sitting. He shifted his stance, one foot edging closer to the door, fingers tapping against his thigh. Katie didn't move, keeping her hand on the door and her eyes on his. I could feel my heart beating fast as I stood behind her, listening for any other sounds outside or inside the house, wondering if he was alone or if someone else was waiting just out of sight. The man stayed right at the door, shifting from foot to foot and repeating that he really needed to come inside. He said, "I just need a minute, please. The signal's no good out here." But I could see his eyes moving, searching, like he was trying to see who else might be in the house. Katie told him again that we could bring the cordless phone out onto the porch. She even picked it up from the kitchen counter and held it up for him to see through the crack in the door. He shook his head, and his tone changed. "No, it has to be a landline, not a cordless," he insisted. "The call won't go through unless I use your actual phone inside." Katie stayed calm, but I saw her grip tighten on the doorframe. I was standing behind her, watching him, and I could feel the tension in the air getting thicker with every second. He asked again if we were alone, if our parents would be home soon, if there was anyone else in the house with us. Every question was too personal, too specific, and none of it was about his supposed truck problem. Katie looked over her shoulder at me and I whispered, "Don't let him in." The man's voice got sharper. "It's cold out here," he said, "and I'm not going to stand on your porch all night. Let me in. You don't want to make a big deal out of nothing." Katie said, "I'm sorry, we can't let you inside, but if you give me the number, I'll call for you." He took another step closer, pressing his face against the crack in the door, and I saw his hand reach out as if he might grab the chain. "Open the door right now," he said, louder than before. The tone in his voice changed from pleading to demanding, and his eyes never left Katie's face. Katie didn't hesitate. She slammed the door shut with all her weight and immediately locked both the handle and deadbolt. I ran from the entryway to check the kitchen door and the sliding doors at the back of the house, making sure everything was locked and the curtains were closed tight. We could hear the man's footsteps on the porch, slow and heavy as he walked to the windows and tried to look inside. At first, he rattled the doorknob and then started knocking again, this time harder and more urgent. Katie and I stayed quiet, holding our breath as we heard him moving along the side of the house. He stopped at the living room windows, cupping his hands to the glass and peering in, then tried the side door that led into the mudroom. It didn't open. He circled the house slowly, checking every window, every door, moving with a patience that didn't make sense for someone stranded or desperate for help. Katie whispered that we should turn off all the lights so he couldn't see us. We moved from room to room, flicking switches, then hurried upstairs and crouched down by the bedroom window to watch him. He was still outside, moving deliberately from one entrance to the next. He didn't look nervous or panicked. He looked focused, like he'd done this before. After a while, we heard him banging against the side gate, then nothing. For almost an hour, we sat in the dark, listening. Every so often there was a noise, footsteps in the gravel, the faint creak of a hinge, the quiet scrape of metal on glass. Sometimes it sounded like he was talking to himself, muttering under his breath. We didn't see anyone else, but the way he acted made it feel like we were being hunted. Around 11, we heard a series of scraping sounds from the back of the house. Someone was trying the handle of the kitchen door, then pushing against the frame hard enough to make the glass vibrate. We stayed hidden at the top of the stairs, the phone clutched in Katie's hand. I was terrified he might get inside, or that there could be more than one of them, waiting for us to make a mistake. The rattling went on for a few minutes, then suddenly stopped. The house was silent again. We didn't dare move, barely breathing as we waited to see if he would try another window or door. We waited in total silence for what felt like forever. When nothing happened for a while, Katie finally called her parents and whispered what was happening. Her dad answered and told us to stay hidden and not to open the door for anyone, no matter what. He said they would leave the fair right away and drive home. Katie kept the phone with her, checking every few minutes for messages or calls. We didn't move from our spot at the top of the stairs. Every sound from outside made us tense up, expecting him to come crashing through a window. After what felt like hours, headlights finally swept across the driveway. We heard the car doors slam, and Katie's parents calling out for us as they came up the porch steps. The man was gone. Her dad walked the perimeter of the house with a big flashlight and checked the road in both directions, but there was no sign of any pickup or anyone walking. He drove up and down the road for several miles, looking for a broken-down vehicle or someone stranded, but the road was empty and silent. The only footprints were the ones circling our house. Katie's mom called the sheriff, who arrived about 30 minutes later. He listened to our story and shook his head. He said there had been other incidents like this in rural areas lately. People pretending to need help to get into houses, sometimes working in groups, sometimes alone. He explained that these criminals watched the houses to learn the routines of the people who lived there, waiting until only the younger ones or women were home before making their move. He praised us for not letting the man inside and for refusing to leave the house or open the door for him. By the time the sheriff left, it was nearly 2 in the morning. Katie's dad sat up all night with the lights on and his truck parked out front. Neither of us slept. We replayed every moment, thinking about what might have happened if we'd let that man in, or if we hadn't locked every door and window. When morning finally came, I packed my bag and said goodbye, promising to text as soon as I got home. I never spent another night in an isolated house without making sure someone knew exactly where I was, who I was with, and when to expect me. I started checking every door and window before bed, every night, no matter where I was. We both did. That weekend was supposed to be just a break from reality, but it changed the way I look at strangers and the way I think about safety, forever. When I was 19, I decided to take a long bus trip from Oregon to visit my friend in Boston. I didn't have much money for hotels, so I figured I'd try sleeping one night in the big 24-hour cafe at the bus terminal. The place looked how you'd expect. Old linoleum floors, bright fluorescent lights, vinyl booths stuck to the walls, and the smell of burned coffee mixed with cleaning spray. There was a humming noise from the soda machine that never really stopped. I found an empty booth way in the back corner, close to a window looking out over the dark, empty parking lot. I took off my backpack and shoved it between my legs so I could keep a foot on the strap, just in case. It was about 10 at night and maybe a dozen other people were scattered around. Some looked like me, travelers, kids with bags and tired faces. A few looked like they worked around here and were on break. There was a group of 2 older women with plastic shopping bags and an old guy reading the paper, his shoes off under the table. The TVs were on but muted, cycling between the weather and some news ticker. I didn't really pay attention. The only staff I saw was an older black man, maybe in his late 50s, who wore a faded green uniform shirt with the cafe logo. He walked from table to table, emptying half-drunk cups and wiping down surfaces, moving slow but steady. He refilled coffee pots from a silver pitcher and brought out baskets of wrapped sandwiches for the little food display. Every now and then, he'd give a polite nod if someone caught his eye. I figured as long as he was there, nobody would mess with me. I slid into the booth, took out my phone, and plugged it into a wall outlet next to the napkin dispenser. The battery was almost dead. I ordered the cheapest thing on the menu, a coffee and a plain bagel, just so I wouldn't get hassled for sitting too long. When the coffee came, it was barely warm, but I drank it anyway, tearing off little pieces of the bagel to eat slowly, trying to make it last. My plan was to stay up a while, then close my eyes and maybe sleep an hour at a time, if no one kicked me out. I watched the staff guy empty the trash, and then stand behind the counter, cleaning the glass. The night felt normal. Not exactly comfortable, but not dangerous. Just tired people passing through, the noise of a bus terminal, the buzz of the lights overhead. I kept scrolling on my phone, reading the same news and messages over and over, just killing time. Around midnight, the crowd thinned out even more. The women with the shopping bags left, and one of the other travelers got up and wheeled his suitcase out into the main terminal. It was quieter now. The man at the counter turned the TV volume up a notch, and the news played some story about a local election. I was yawning, feeling my eyes get heavy, when I noticed a middle-aged white guy, probably late 40s, heading my way from across the room. He wore a gray zip-up hoodie and faded jeans, and his hair looked greasy and combed flat, like he'd slept on it. He didn't have any bags, just 2 cups of coffee in his hands. He walked right up to my table with a friendly kind of smile. "Hey, I accidentally ordered an extra coffee," he said, holding out one of the cups. "Didn't want it to go to waste." His voice was quiet and polite, the kind you hear at a bus stop or laundromat when someone wants to make small talk. I thanked him and took the coffee, feeling weird, but not wanting to be rude. He stood there for a moment, looking at me, not moving off. He asked where I was headed. I said I was just waiting for my bus in the morning and tried to keep it vague. He nodded, acting interested, and started talking about how he'd been traveling for work, something about going to see his sister. But his story was generic and didn't stick in my head. The whole thing felt a little strange. Not super threatening, but just off enough to make me notice. I didn't see why anyone would give away a fresh coffee to a stranger unless they wanted something, but I was tired and didn't want to make a scene or look paranoid. He smiled again, wished me a safe trip, and then walked back to his own table, which was all the way across the room, near the front windows. I set the new cup of coffee down next to my own and left it untouched. I went back to my phone, but now I was more awake, glancing up every few minutes to see if he was looking my way. He just sat down, pulled out his own phone, and sipped his coffee, not watching me that I could see. I tried to shrug it off. Maybe he really did just order too much coffee. Still, I didn't drink what he'd given me. I kept scrolling, telling myself not to overthink it. The minutes dragged by, and I found myself watching the clock more than the screen, waiting for morning and my next bus out. I was about to take my first sip of the coffee when the older worker appeared at my table. He didn't say much at first, just wiped the surface and picked up my empty cup. Then he leaned in close, acting like he was clearing crumbs, and spoke in a low voice. "Don't drink from that cup. I saw that man put something in your coffee when you were looking at your phone." His face was serious, not panicked, but I could tell this wasn't a joke or a misunderstanding. I froze with the cup in my hand, suddenly aware of how easily I could have taken a sip without thinking. He kept his body between me and the rest of the cafe, talking softly. He told me he'd seen things like this before, especially at night when people came through on layovers, tired or half asleep, and let their guard down. He said he always tried to watch for it, but he couldn't catch everything. My heart was pounding as I glanced over at the man who'd given me the coffee. He was staring straight at me now, no smile left, just a blank, almost angry look that made my hands shake. The worker quietly stood up straight and told me to stay put. Then he walked across the room, moving with the same calm steps he'd used all night. He stopped by the man's table and spoke to him quietly, pointing toward the counter. I couldn't hear what was being said, but I saw the man push his chair back and stand up, hands in his pockets. The two of them walked slowly to the door. The worker kept himself between the man and the rest of the cafe. Outside, they stood under the harsh yellow parking lot lights. I could see their shadows moving on the sidewalk through the big window. The worker talked with his hands, pointing out toward the lot and then back at the door. The man argued for a few minutes, gesturing back at the cafe like he was upset, but the worker never moved away or let him pass. Finally, the man pulled his hood up, turned around, and walked off into the dark, moving quickly past the line of parked cars. I watched until he disappeared into the shadows, half expecting him to turn around, but he didn't. When the worker came back inside, he walked straight to my booth and told me in a quiet voice that he'd called security. He said he'd dealt with guys like that before, travelers who weren't really travelers, just predators looking for someone tired and alone. The terminal drew people like that, he explained, because it was open all night and full of people who had nowhere else to go. He told me this was not the first time he'd seen someone try to drug a drink, but he tried to step in when he could, even if it meant dealing with angry men outside. He didn't try to scare me, but made it clear that what had happened was serious. He told me to dump the coffee in the bathroom and not to accept anything else from anyone for the rest of the night. I did what he said, pouring the cup out and rinsing it in the sink, my hands still shaking as I watched the brown liquid swirl away. I kept thinking about how close I'd come, how easy it would have been for me to trust someone just because they smiled and seemed harmless. After that, the worker stayed near my table for the rest of the night. He made small talk with some of the regulars, wiped down tables that were already clean, and checked in on me every half hour or so. He asked if I wanted more food or a new cup of coffee, but I just shook my head, too on edge to eat or drink anything. I kept my bag at my feet and barely slept, watching the front doors and flinching every time someone new walked in. Nobody bothered me. The cafe got quiet as the night went on, just the buzz of the lights and the faint sound of buses idling outside. Around 6 in the morning, the first rush of travelers for the early buses started to trickle in. I packed up my things and checked the schedule on my phone. The worker came over one last time and asked if I needed help finding my gate. When I shook my head, he smiled and told me to stick to busy areas and keep my bag close. He walked with me through the terminal to the main doors, staying close until I was in sight of the bus. At the door, he nodded, wished me a safe trip, and then turned back toward the cafe without another word. I never found out the worker's name, but I'll never forget how he helped me that night. If he hadn't been paying attention, I probably wouldn't be here telling this story. I spent the whole ride to Boston thinking about how danger doesn't always look dangerous, and how sometimes the only thing between you and something terrible is a stranger who cares enough to get involved. Now, I never accept food or drinks from people I don't know. I watch my stuff like a hawk, and I don't let myself get distracted in public spaces, no matter how tired I am. I learned that the people who look out for you can come out of nowhere, and sometimes the ones who look safest are the ones you have to watch the closest. That night could have ended so much worse if one person hadn't decided to speak up. Last year, I was running a small construction crew with my partner Steve and his wife Carol. We got a contract to do interior renovation on this big old house in the suburbs. The owner lived out of state and wanted to flip it after we finished the work. The place had been empty for months, which was perfect because we could work whatever hours we wanted without disturbing anyone. It was a beautiful house, probably built in the 1920s, with high ceilings and detailed woodwork throughout. The job was supposed to take about 3 weeks and the pay was good, so we were all excited to get started. The first day, Steve and I met the locksmith at sunrise to change out the locks and make sure nobody else had a key. Carol showed up a little after with coffee and bagels for everyone. We all walked through the place, snapping pictures and making lists. The sun coming through the big stained glass window in the stairwell made the dust in the air look like glitter. It was cold inside even with the sun up, and the old radiators clanked and hissed while we worked. I remember noticing right away how the place felt too still, like there wasn't a single sound from outside. The nearest neighbor was a good half-acre away, separated by a big hedge. Steve joked it was the perfect murder house. We all laughed it off. The first 2 days went smoothly as we assessed what needed to be done and started tearing out old fixtures. We had complete access to the house and worked until after dark, since there were no neighbors close enough to complain about noise. Steve and I started in the living room, prying up cracked floorboards and pulling old wires through the walls. Carol was upstairs measuring windows for replacement. Every so often, she'd call down for us to help move something heavy or check a weird measurement. There was some water damage under the upstairs bathroom, and the wallpaper had started to peel away in the corners, exposing old, faded pencil marks that looked like maybe they were left by kids decades ago. In the kitchen, Steve found a box of yellowed receipts and old pay stubs under a loose floorboard, but nothing of real value. We threw out rusted metal, broken glass, and stacks of warped plywood. Every room had its own set of creaks and groans, but it all felt like normal old house sounds. On the third day, we decided to push late into the evening to finish demo work on the second floor. Carol was handling cleanup while Steve and I focused on removing old plumbing fixtures. The house was big enough that we often worked in different areas and communicated by shouting between rooms. I was in the kitchen, crouched under the sink, disconnecting an old cast-iron pipe, and Steve was in the hallway with a sawzall, trying to cut out a section of metal vent. We'd brought in extra work lights and long extension cords, and the place was full of shadows and pools of harsh white light. Carol's steps moved from room to room overhead, steady and quick. I remember her humming to herself, a habit of hers when she was trying to stay focused. Around 9 at night, Carol went upstairs to sweep debris from one of the bedrooms we'd been working in. Steve and I were downstairs in the kitchen, discussing plans for the next day's work. The only sounds were our voices, the electric saw, and the occasional thud from above as Carol pushed a heavy piece of trim into the hallway. I was kneeling on the floor, pulling at a stubborn section of pipe, when we both heard Carol scream from somewhere above us. It wasn't just a startled yelp. It was a full-blown scream of terror that made both of us drop our tools and run for the stairs. The noise echoed through the empty house. We could hear something crashing and banging around up there, like furniture being knocked over. I took the steps 2 at a time, Steve right behind me. As we reached the landing, there was another loud crash from the guest bedroom at the end of the hall. The light was on inside, but the door was half closed. I could see a shadow moving quickly past the gap and Carol's voice, high and desperate, yelling, "Get out! Get out!" Steve pushed past me, shoving the door open. The old brass knob slipped in his hand, but he forced it. Inside, the whole room was a mess. Dresser tipped over, a shattered lamp on the floor, and dust in the air. Carol was in the far corner, pressed up against the wall, clutching a broom handle, her eyes wide. Steve started to say something, but she just kept shouting, "He was here! He was just here!" She pointed at the open window. The old screen was hanging half out, the bottom bent like someone had kicked it loose from the inside. Steve looked out into the night, but there was nothing to see, just the dark yard, the big hedge, and empty space beyond. Carol kept gasping for breath, backing away from the window, still holding the broom like a weapon. I could see the marks on the sill, the streaks of dirt, and the deep, fresh scuff on the floor below. Steve asked her, "What happened? Who was here?" But she just shook her head, her whole body shaking, staring at the open window. I moved to the window and looked down, but saw nothing in the darkness. Carol wouldn't move from her corner, and Steve started checking the hallway and other rooms, his steps urgent, his voice low and tight. I stayed by the window, listening, waiting for another sound, while Carol's breathing echoed in the empty house. We found Carol on the floor of the master bedroom, surrounded by spilled paint and an overturned ladder. She was pointing at a large walk-in closet with its door standing wide open. As we helped her up, she kept saying, "There's someone in there. There's someone in the closet." Steve and I looked where she was pointing and saw a man crouched in the back corner of the closet, trying to hide behind some hanging clothes that had been left by the previous owners. He looked like he'd been living rough for a while. Dirty clothes, unkempt hair, and the kind of thin build that comes from not eating regularly. The guy looked terrified, which was almost as scary as finding him there in the first place. He pressed himself further into the corner, barely making a sound. We realized, while we'd been working in this house for 3 days, someone had been living here the entire time. Carol stayed on the floor, gripping my arm tight, not taking her eyes off the man in the closet. Steve stepped between her and the door, holding up a hand to try and keep the situation calm. The man started mumbling something under his breath, voice too quiet to understand at first. When he looked up at us, his eyes were wide and wild, darting between the 3 of us and the doorway, as if trying to figure out if he could make a run for it. Steve kept his voice low and steady, asking, "How long have you been here?" The guy didn't answer, just stared. Carol whispered, he's got something in his hand. And I saw he was holding a screwdriver, half hidden in his fist. I kept my hands up and told him, "We don't want any trouble, just stay where you are." The man looked ready to bolt. We backed out of the closet, pulling Carol with us, and shut the door between us and him, not locking it, but just creating a barrier. Steve said, "We need to call the cops now." I agreed, but I didn't take my eyes off the door. We all stepped out into the hallway, trying to keep quiet, listening for any movement inside the closet or the rest of the house. The man in the closet started babbling about how they weren't hurting anyone and just needed a place to stay. That's when we realized he'd said they, meaning there were others. Steve told everyone to stay calm while I called the police, but before we could do anything else, we heard footsteps running through other parts of the house. 2 more people, both men, were trying to get out through different exits. One ran past us on the stairs heading for the front door, almost knocking Steve aside as he went. The guy barely looked at us, just sprinted for the door and disappeared into the night. We could hear the other one crashing around in the basement, making so much noise it sounded like he was tearing the place apart. I called the police, hands shaking, and tried to describe what was happening. Carol stayed close to me, holding her phone but not dialing, just watching the stairwell and the hallway. Steve went to the top of the basement steps and shouted down, telling whoever was down there to come up and leave. No answer, just more banging and scraping. The cops arrived within 10 minutes. Sirens off, lights low. 2 cars, 4 officers, flashlights cutting through the shadows. They swept the house room by room, yelling out warnings, hands on their holsters. They found the man from the closet still hiding in the same spot, frozen, the screwdriver on the floor next to him. They found the guy who ran downstairs hiding behind the furnace in the basement, holding a broken broom handle like a club. The third man, the one who ran out the door, was caught by the police in the backyard, trying to climb the hedge into the neighbor's lot. All 3 were dirty, scared, and looked like they hadn't slept inside a real bed in months. They'd been living there since before we started the job, sneaking in through a broken basement window and surviving on food scrounged from neighborhood garbage cans. They had sleeping bags, personal belongings, and even makeshift weapons hidden throughout the house, knives made from scrap metal, scissors taped to broom handles, and heavy pipes stashed behind doors. The cops took them out in handcuffs, not roughly but without much patience either, while Steve and I stood in the hallway, watching. The police found knives, scissors, and other improvised weapons that the squatters had collected, probably for protection but potentially dangerous to anyone who surprised them. We realized these people had been watching us work for 3 days, learning our routines and staying hidden during the hours we were there. The house suddenly didn't feel empty anymore, not even with the lights on and the cops in every room. We waited outside while the officers searched the whole property. They took out bags of trash, torn blankets, old backpacks, and a pile of broken glass that someone had been using to wedge a closet door shut from the inside. The property owner called us that night, apologizing and promising to have security in place before we came back. The next day, a new crew came and installed alarms on every window and door, motion detectors in the hallways, locks on every basement entrance. There was even a big metal box with a keypad on the front porch that the security company would check each morning and night. None of us felt comfortable working there after dark anymore, knowing how easily people could hide in a large, empty house. Carol started insisting we do a full sweep of every room, every closet, every crawl space before picking up a single tool. Steve brought his old baseball bat with him and kept it nearby. I started double-checking the back doors and making sure the windows were all secure before we left for the night. The job took an extra week to finish, partly because we never worked past sunset again. On the last day, as we loaded up the truck, Carol found a stash of old photographs hidden behind the furnace. Pictures of the house from years before, back when it was lived in and warm. It made me think about all the other renovation jobs I'd done in vacant properties, and wonder how many times we might have had unseen company. The experience taught our whole crew to do thorough walkthroughs of any empty building before starting work, because you never know who might have decided to call it home. When I was 32 and barely a month out from my divorce, I decided to try online dating for the first time. I hadn't dated anyone new since my early 20s, and now everything felt different. Apps, swiping, matching, all that. It felt like everyone I knew was either married, engaged, or busy telling me how fun it was to be single again. I downloaded an app that a coworker suggested, something that everyone at the office claimed was safe and normal, and I set up a profile. I didn't know what kind of pictures to use, so I picked some from a family barbecue, a couple of selfies, and one with my dog. Within the first week, I matched with a guy named Brad. He seemed decent enough. Early 40s, short hair, button-down shirts, always standing next to nice cars or city views in his photos. The pictures almost looked like they were from stock image sites, all clean backgrounds and perfect lighting. But I convinced myself that he just had a friend who was good with a camera. Our conversations were easy, but looking back, they were kind of surface level. Work, travel, favorite foods, nothing too personal. He told me he worked in tech, something about software development, but he never really got into details, always changing the subject back to movies or music. Still, I was new to this, and after 3 days of messaging back and forth, Brad suggested we meet for a drink at Golden Oak, a bar in the middle of downtown. I'd been there before. The place was busy on weekends, lots of people, decent lighting, and plenty of exits. He picked Friday night, and I agreed. He texted me early that afternoon. Looking forward to tonight. Let me know if you get there before me. I got ready, trying not to overthink it. I chose jeans and a black sweater, the most neutral thing I owned. I arrived at Golden Oak a few minutes before 7. The bar was crowded, groups of friends laughing, some couples by the windows, sports on the TVs above the bar. I picked a spot near the entrance so I could see everyone who came in. At 7:15, I got a text from Brad. "Sorry, running a bit behind. Be there soon." I ordered myself a drink, thinking it was just traffic. By 7:30, he hadn't arrived. Another text. "Stuck in traffic. Would you mind meeting at Greystone Lounge instead? It's 2 blocks over and way less crowded. I'll get us a table." I'd never been to Greystone, but I looked it up and it seemed fine. Another bar, slightly fancier, still in a busy part of downtown. I hesitated. My gut told me it was strange for him to pick a new spot so late, but I didn't want to seem rude or make things awkward. I texted back, "Okay, I'll head over." I finished my drink, left a tip, and walked the 2 blocks to Greystone. It was quieter, with dark wood furniture and soft lighting, only a handful of people at the tables. I checked my phone, no new messages. I found a table by the window, sat down, and waited. By now it was nearly 8. I was starting to regret not leaving after the first half hour. I thought about making an excuse to go home, but before I could decide, someone approached my table. "Are you Sarah?" he asked. I looked up. The man standing there was older than the guy in the photos, at least late 40s or early 50s. His hair was thinning, and his face was rounder, jaw less defined. He wore a wrinkled shirt and a jacket that looked like it hadn't been washed in a while. I stared for a second, not sure if it was a mistake. He smiled, uncomfortable, then said, "Sorry I'm late. I'm Brad." Right then, I knew I'd been catfished. He looked nothing like his photos, not even close. Not just a bad angle or old pictures, but an entirely different person. I felt heat rush to my face and glanced away, embarrassed that I hadn't left earlier, that I'd let myself end up in this situation. I looked at the door, tempted to just walk out, but I felt trapped by politeness and a little ashamed for not trusting my gut. He sat down across from me, acting like everything was fine, like this was just a normal date. He started talking fast, as if he wanted to distract me from what had just happened. Sorry about all the delays. Work's been crazy since I got laid off. He went on about his job in programming, but quickly shifted to how he was driving for delivery apps now, staying in a rented room across town. He mentioned moving here last year, then said he'd grown up locally, then switched back again. His stories tangled together, none of them matching what he told me online. I picked up on little contradictions. He said he didn't own a car, but all his photos had him posing next to expensive vehicles. He said he hated bars, but then described himself as a regular at several places downtown. Each time I tried to ask a question, he changed the subject. I forced a smile, nodding, looking around the room for a way out. I kept my purse on my lap and my phone unlocked in my hand. He started asking questions about my work, how long I'd been single, what part of town I lived in. Not in a friendly way, more like he was gathering details. I gave short answers, kept things vague. He talked about how hard it was to meet people, how most women on these apps were too judgmental, how everyone expected too much. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. I checked the time on my phone. I needed to end this date, but I was still trying to figure out how to do it without causing a scene or making things uncomfortable. I told him I had to get up early for work the next day, hoping he'd take the hint. He didn't. He kept talking, voice getting faster, eyes flicking from me to the door and back again. I started planning how to get out of there as quickly and safely as I could, rehearsing what I'd say and watching for the first pause in his rambling that would let me leave. Brad's behavior got worse the longer we sat there. At first, he just kept talking over me, asking questions and not listening to anything I said. Then he started reaching for my hand, trying to hold it across the table. I pulled away, but he kept trying, his fingers brushing my knuckles and making my skin crawl. He leaned in close and whispered that I should come back to his place after, that he lived right up the street, and it would be more private. I laughed it off and said I was tired and had work early. He got annoyed and said I was one of those uptight types, that I needed to relax and live a little. I could see other people in the bar starting to notice the way our conversation was going. The bartender kept glancing over. Brad either didn't notice or didn't care. He waved down the server and ordered another drink, even though I'd already told him I was about to leave. He moved his chair closer, blocking me in on one side. He asked if I'd ever been with someone like him before, then laughed at his own question. I felt stuck, but I told him again that I really needed to go. When the server set down his drink, I took the chance to stand up, grabbing my purse off the table. "I have to go," I said as steadily as I could. He frowned, took a sip of his drink, then said I was just being dramatic. I ignored him and started walking toward the exit. As soon as we got outside, Brad followed me. He moved faster, cutting me off before I could cross the street toward the parking garage. His voice got louder. "You really just going to bail like that? After I waited all night?" I kept walking, not answering, just trying to keep my pace steady. He kept pace with me, matching every step, saying I was wasting his time, that I should have told him from the start if I wasn't interested. I didn't look at him. I just wanted to get to my car and lock the door. I could feel my heart racing. Inside the parking garage, the echoes made his voice sound even harsher. When I got to my car, he stepped in front of the driver's side door, blocking me. He grabbed my arm, not hard enough to leave a bruise, but hard enough to make me stop and look at him. He leaned in close, his breath sour, and tried to kiss me. I jerked my head away and pulled my arm free. "Don't touch me," I said, raising my voice. He grabbed for me again and I started yelling as loud as I could. "Help! Get away from me!" The shout bounced off the concrete walls. A security guard from the mall came jogging over, radio in hand. "Is there a problem here?" he called out. Brad let go of me, taking a step back and glaring at both of us. "She's being crazy," he muttered. I moved away from him, putting my car between us, and the guard positioned himself between us. "You need to leave, sir," the guard said, staying calm but firm. Brad looked at me one last time, pure anger in his eyes, then turned and walked away, still muttering under his breath. I fumbled with my keys, got into my car, and locked the doors. I watched him disappear into the stairwell before I let myself breathe again. I got home and tried to convince myself it was over, that he'd move on and forget about me. But the next morning, my phone started buzzing before I even left for work. At first, it was one text, then another, then 10 more, then dozens. He called me every name you can think of, accused me of being a liar, told me I'd regret making him look stupid in public. He said he was going to come find me at work. He described the outfit I'd worn the night before, and said he wasn't finished with me yet. My hands shook as I blocked his number, but the messages kept coming from new numbers, emails, even social media accounts I didn't remember linking to the app. By lunchtime, I was so rattled that I started taking screenshots of every single message, every threat, every insult. I saved them to my cloud account just in case he tried to hack my phone or delete things somehow. My coworkers could tell something was wrong, but I didn't say anything until after lunch, when I got a message that said, "I know where you live." That was it. No more chances. I told my manager I needed to take the afternoon off for an emergency, and I drove straight to the police station. The officer at the desk listened to everything, looked through the screenshots, and nodded like he'd seen this 100 times. He filed a report for harassment, made copies of everything I showed him, and told me to save any new messages in case they needed more evidence. He said if Brad ever tried to show up at my job or apartment, to call 911 immediately and not try to talk to him myself. On my way out, he said, "You did the right thing coming in." I nodded, but I felt more tired than relieved. That night, I deleted the dating app, shut down my old accounts, and started new ones with the highest privacy settings I could find. I told friends what happened and made a rule for myself. Never meet anyone new alone. Always pick public places, and if anything feels off, I leave right away. It's been months now, and I haven't heard from Brad again, but sometimes I still check the locks twice before going to bed. I never thought something like this would happen to me, but I learned that you can't always spot danger until it's already way too close. Three years ago, when I was 19, my parents had to go out of town for the weekend. They left me in charge of the house, but mainly they needed someone to watch my older sister and our new baby brother, who was only 2 months old at the time. It wasn't really a big deal because my sister was almost never home anyway. The plan was for her to stay over at her friend's place, which meant for once, I'd have the whole house to myself except for the baby. That sounded pretty good to me, honestly. The only thing I had to do was keep the baby fed, change him, and make sure he slept. Our house isn't anything fancy, just a 2-story in a quiet neighborhood with a finished basement. My parents had always kept the storage room in the basement locked up tight. There was a small wooden door near the laundry area, and a single key for it hung on the key hook in the kitchen, same place as the garage and mailbox keys. The storage room wasn't big, maybe 4 feet by 8, just enough space for shelves. Nobody really talked about it. I'd never seen inside, and neither had my sister, as far as I knew. My mom just said it was for old tools and things that didn't matter. There were some pipes that ran along the wall behind it, and I guess maybe utility meters were in there too, but it never seemed important enough to ask about. It was just this part of the house that we ignored. That first night, I ordered pizza for dinner, watched YouTube on my laptop, and checked on the baby every half hour. My parents had set up his crib in my sister's old room upstairs so I could hear him if he cried. I went up a couple times to peek in, but he slept through most of the evening, making those quiet little baby sounds that let you know he's still breathing. By around 10 o'clock, the house was totally quiet. I turned off the TV and started scrolling on my phone, not really doing anything. I remember noticing how silent everything was when you're actually alone. No TV, no one talking, just the hum of the fridge and the faint tick of the clock on the wall. I wasn't scared, but it felt weird having so much space to myself. I could hear a bit of wind through the chimney and the usual creaks from the heating pipes. Every now and then, there was a little knock from somewhere in the walls, but our house always did that. I told myself it was probably nothing, just settling, but I did get up twice to check the back door and all the windows, just to be sure they were locked. Everything was fine. I went to the kitchen, got a glass of water, and looked at the key hooks. All the keys were in their usual places, including the one to the storage room. I decided to head to bed around 11, but I got distracted looking at messages on my phone. I sat on the couch in the living room, half listening for any sign that the baby was awake. I started thinking, maybe I should just sleep downstairs so I wouldn't be too far from the kitchen and the front door. Before I did, I walked the whole house, turning off the lights, making sure the doors were locked again. When I got back to the living room, I stopped and listened. I thought I heard something from upstairs, like a quiet thump or the sound of something brushing the floor. I stood still for a second, holding my breath, but I didn't hear it again. I figured it was probably just the baby rolling over or maybe the cat jumping off a bed, except we didn't have a cat anymore. That detail stuck in my mind for a minute, but I pushed it away. I sat back down, tried to focus on my phone, and tried to ignore the fact that now the house felt way too quiet. The clock in the hall ticked on, every second sounding loud. At some point, I must have dozed off, because the next thing I remember is being jolted awake by a soft sound from the kitchen. It wasn't loud, just a metallic clink, like keys being moved. I blinked a few times and sat up, heart beating a little faster now. I listened again, waiting for another sound, but everything was silent. I stood up, walked carefully into the kitchen, and looked around. The light over the sink was still on, making everything look yellow and flat. Nothing seemed out of place at first, but then I looked down and saw the key to the storage room lying on the floor, right in the middle of the kitchen tiles. I stopped, staring at it. I was completely sure I'd seen that key hanging on the hook earlier, right next to the garage key. I hadn't touched it, and nobody else was supposed to be home. I picked it up and put it back on the hook, suddenly feeling a little cold. My first thought was maybe my sister had come back for some reason, but I hadn't heard the door, and her shoes weren't by the front entrance. I checked both doors again. Locked, just like before. I tried to call my sister, but she didn't pick up. So I texted two of my friends, telling them I thought someone might be in the house and that I was going to check on the baby. One of them called me right away, and I told him to call the police if I didn't answer in 5 minutes. I grabbed the biggest kitchen knife I could find, which felt stupid, but my hands were shaking. I walked quietly up the stairs, each step creaking under my feet. I listened hard for anything, any voice or movement, but it was silent except for the faint sound of the baby's sound machine humming through the open door at the end of the hall. I peeked in, saw the baby sleeping in his crib, his face turned sideways, breathing softly. Relief hit me for a second, but then I heard something else. a door slamming shut somewhere in the hallway. It was the bathroom door, the one halfway between my room and the baby's. The sound echoed sharp and clear. I stood there frozen, staring at the shadows stretching across the floor, and tried to hear if there was any movement on the other side of that door. My heart was pounding so hard that I could feel it in my throat. There was no doubt now. Someone else was in the house with me and the baby. I pressed my ear to the bathroom door, straining to hear any sound. I caught the shuffle of feet and the faintest clink of something metal. I tried to slow my breathing, but every sound from inside made my hands shake harder. I backed away quietly and stepped into my bedroom, keeping my eyes on the bathroom door as I rummaged through my closet for anything I could use. My fingers wrapped around the old baseball bat I kept from high school. I took it out, weighed it in my hands, and walked back into the hall. Standing by the bathroom door, I tried to keep my voice steady. "The police are coming," I shouted. "You need to get out now." I started pounding the bat against the door, not caring about the noise. For a second there was silence, then all at once a man's voice erupted from inside, screaming back at me. The sound was rough and angry, and it didn't sound like anyone I knew. He yelled something I couldn't make out, just a jumble of words and panic. The voice alone was enough to turn my legs to jelly, but I forced myself to keep banging on the door. I wanted him to know I wasn't alone, even if I really was. There was more noise from inside, something being shoved against the door. I heard water splashing onto the floor and the unmistakable sound of the window lock being fiddled with. For a split second, I considered running in, but common sense stopped me. I ducked into my room and dragged a chair out into the hallway, jamming it tight under the bathroom door handle. It was the only thing I could think of to slow him down if he tried to bolt. As soon as the chair was wedged in place, I heard the sharp squeak of the bathroom window being pushed open. I ran to the back of the house and looked through the hall window, just in time to see a figure clambering out onto the small balcony that ran along the upper floor. Our house was attached to the neighbors by those old wooden balconies, and there was only a narrow gap between them. I watched the man's shadow leap across, land hard, and disappear out of sight. I rushed downstairs and out the front door, craning my neck to look at the rooftops. All I could see was the shape of someone running, arms pumping, feet landing light and quick on the neighbor's roof. I screamed after him, hoping someone would hear, but he was already too far away. 10 minutes later, red and blue lights flashed down the street, and 2 police officers pounded up our driveway. By then, the intruder was long gone. The police spent almost an hour combing through every room. They checked the closets, the garage, under every bed, even the crawl spaces in the basement. A neighbor had seen someone jump across the balcony but lost sight of him in the dark. They asked me questions about what I'd seen, what I'd heard, and if anything was missing. My sister showed up halfway through, crying and apologizing for leaving me alone, but it didn't matter anymore. The only thing that mattered was making sure the baby was safe. The officers promised to patrol the neighborhood through the night, but I knew already they wouldn't find the guy. He was gone. When the police started their investigation for real, they asked if there were any rooms in the house nobody ever went into. I told them about the storage room in the basement, the one with the old wooden door. They took the key from the hook and went down ahead of me, flashlight sweeping over every inch of the concrete floor. When they unlocked the door and swung it open, I could see right away that something was wrong. Instead of boxes and tools, the floor was covered with a pile of old blankets, like a makeshift bed. In one corner were stacks of canned food, empty water bottles, and plastic bags stuffed with clothes. There was a small flashlight, a pocket knife, and a few wrappers from food I recognized from our own pantry. The worst part was on the shelves. Laid out in a neat row were some of our old family photos, the kind that had sat on the fireplace mantel or in frames upstairs. Pictures of me and my sister as kids, my parents on vacation, the baby's first day home from the hospital. Someone had taken them down, removed the frames, and put them here. There were even a couple of photos I didn't remember being taken at all, as if someone had used their phone to snap them through our window or when we weren't looking. The police officer took a deep breath and told me quietly that whoever had been here knew our family, knew our routines. The locks on the storage room door had scratches around the keyhole, marks where someone had used tools to pick the lock, probably more than once. They bagged up everything as evidence. When they checked the back door and the basement windows, they found small scratches in the paint and dust disturbed under the window ledges. Someone had been getting in and out for weeks, maybe even longer. The police thought the intruder had been living inside the storage room, watching us, waiting for the right time. He knew when we left, when we came back, even when the baby was sleeping. I tried to remember if I'd ever felt watched, if I'd seen anything out of place before that night, but I couldn't. It felt like everything had changed in a single hour. We didn't stay in that house much longer. My parents came home and packed up the baby's things that night, refusing to leave us alone again. Within 2 months, we moved across town. My sister refused to talk about it. I kept thinking about the way that key had ended up on the kitchen floor, as if he wanted me to find it, as if he wanted me to know he was there. Even now, years later, I check every lock twice before I go to bed. I don't think I'll ever stop. In December 2018, when I was 17, I was taking the bus home from my art classes like I did every Tuesday. It was already getting dark by the time I got out, and the bus stop was at the end of a long street that always seemed colder than everywhere else. I kept my hands in my jacket pockets, clutching my sketchbook and a bag of brushes and pencils. The streetlights flickered, lighting up the empty benches at the stop, and the bus was late as usual. When it finally came, only 2 people got off and nobody else was waiting to get on but me. I picked the seat in the middle, pressed my bag to my side, and looked out the window. 2 stops later, this guy got on. Looked like a college student, a bit older, but nothing that stood out. He was clean-shaven, wearing a black jacket and jeans, hair a little messy like he hadn't bothered with it, but nothing that made me nervous. He scanned the empty rows, then came straight down and sat in the seat next to mine, even though the whole bus was empty. He didn't look over at first, just sat quietly, elbows tucked in, hands neat in his lap. For a minute I tried to ignore him and stared at the blurred trees outside, but after a few stops, he glanced at my lap and nodded at my sketchbook. "You in art school?" he asked. I said yeah, and he smiled like he was genuinely interested, asked what I liked to draw, if I painted or just sketched, things like that. His questions were normal, nothing pushy. He looked me in the eye when he spoke, his voice calm and kind of soft. He introduced himself as Alex. He said he was 22 and studied marketing at the university nearby. I told him my name and tried to sound casual, not wanting to seem rude. Alex asked if I always carried that much stuff around. I laughed a little and said, "Only on Tuesdays." He said he did the same, but with textbooks and not art stuff. The bus was quiet, except for a couple in the back, and the driver's voice muttering on the radio. Alex said he worked part-time at a small electronics store not far from the university, that he usually closed up on Thursdays, and he liked having different routines each day to keep things interesting. He asked where my stop was, and I told him near the library. He said he used to go to the library a lot when he first moved here, but didn't have much time anymore. The whole time, nothing felt off. He didn't sit too close, didn't make any weird comments, just seemed genuinely bored and passing time. He leaned back and asked about my classes, what kind of teachers I had, what projects I was working on. I told him about the portrait I was doing for homework, and he nodded along, saying he wished he could draw. He asked what kind of music I liked, if I listened to it while drawing. It felt like a pretty normal conversation. The sun was gone now, and the windows just showed reflections. I remember watching the streetlights go by, counting the stops. Alex started talking about his friends, how they all ended up in different courses, and he didn't get to see them much except for random meetups after class. A few stops later, the couple in the back got off and the bus was almost empty. Alex didn't move. He pulled his phone out and checked the time, then glanced over at me again. He asked if I ever went to parties, if art school was just all artsy types, or if people actually did stuff together. I said I didn't really know. I just had a small group I usually hung out with. He nodded and laughed, said marketing students were all the same, always pretending to network but really just wanting to drink. I kind of smiled and looked away, not sure what else to say. My stop was coming up in a few minutes. Alex kept talking, saying he liked finding new music, new people to talk to, that it was hard meeting anyone outside of classes. He seemed harmless, honestly. When he shifted in his seat, his phone buzzed. He read a message and put it away, saying his friends were bothering him about some last-minute plans. I didn't pay much attention, just pulled out my own phone to text my mom and let her know I was almost home. It was just another Tuesday, nothing special. Then Alex looked over at me and said his friends were having a party that night at his buddy's apartment. He said it wasn't anything crazy, just a few people playing games and listening to music. He said they wanted to invite a couple of new faces, that sometimes it was good to mix things up. I kind of shrugged, said I wasn't much for parties, and he nodded like he understood. "It's nothing wild," he said. "Just a bunch of us eating snacks, listening to music. You can stop by for an hour if you want. You don't have to stay." He started listing off what they'd have: board games, playlists, maybe some pizza. He said everyone was chill, no pressure. I told him I had to get home soon, that I didn't really know anyone there, and he just kept smiling, saying, "You'll fit in, trust me. It's low-key." He said I could leave whenever I wanted, that he'd make sure nobody bugged me if I just wanted to hang for a bit and then dip out. The bus rolled over a bump, and I gripped my sketchbook tighter. I felt awkward, but he was still smiling, trying to convince me. He said, "Come on, you've got to try something new once in a while. If you hate it, you can leave." He laughed again. "I promise, it's not that serious." He kept talking, saying it was just a way to meet people, that sometimes you get stuck in a routine and need to do something different. I looked down at my bag and then back out the window. I thought about it, realized I didn't have any homework due, and said maybe I could stop by for a little while. I texted my mom that I'd be home later than usual, just to cover myself. Alex grinned, said I wouldn't regret it. He asked for my number so he could send me the address, and I hesitated, but gave it to him. The bus slowed near the next stop and I got up, slinging my bag over my shoulder. Alex said, "I'll text you the details. See you there?" I nodded, stepped off the bus, and watched as it pulled away into the dark. We took the bus to an older part of town where the sidewalks were cracked and the street lights didn't really reach the corners. The buildings all looked tired, dirty brick with rust stains on the window frames. Alex seemed relaxed, but as we walked from the bus stop, I realized he wasn't making small talk anymore. He just looked at his phone and led the way, barely glancing at me. We cut through an alley behind a row of closed shops. There was broken glass near the dumpsters, and the only sound was our footsteps. The apartment building was just 3 floors, concrete steps, chipped paint on the door. He opened it without a key, just buzzed and waited. The inside smelled like cigarette smoke and something greasy. We climbed up to the 2nd floor and he knocked on a door with faded numbers. It swung open almost right away. 4 men were inside. None of them looked like students. One had a shaved head and thick beard. maybe mid-30s. Another wore a stained hoodie and barely glanced at me before turning down the music on a speaker. The others looked rough, tired, with hard eyes. They barely said hello. Alex introduced me, but nobody gave their names. There were empty beer cans on the coffee table, and the furniture looked like it had been pulled from the street. The walls were bare except for a few taped-up flyers. The air felt heavy, like nobody had opened a window in weeks. One of the guys sat in the only armchair, just staring at me. The others stood around, all watching. There wasn't any sign of food or games or music except for the cheap speaker. Nobody laughed or seemed excited. It was too quiet for a party. They started asking questions right away, not friendly stuff. One asked if I lived alone or with family. Another wanted to know what school I went to, what time my classes ended. They pressed for details about my parents, if they worked late, if I ever had the house to myself. I tried to keep my answers short, but they kept circling back to where I lived, and if anyone was waiting for me. Nobody smiled. Alex stood off to the side, hands in his pockets, not saying much anymore. One of the men offered me a beer, holding it out like a dare. I shook my head and said I didn't drink. He looked annoyed and set it back down. Another guy said I should take my coat off and stay a while, said it was just getting started. I stayed standing, clutching my bag. The apartment owner, the guy in the armchair, said I looked tired, and maybe I should just crash there, since it was late and the buses weren't reliable. He said, "No point in going home now. You can sleep on the couch." The way he said it, like it was already decided, made my skin crawl. They moved closer, trying to block the door a little. One leaned against it, casual but not really. The man who'd offered the beer said nobody would bother me there, that I was safe. My hands were sweating. I looked at my phone, pretended it was vibrating. I told them my mom was calling, that she was strict, and would freak out if I didn't answer. The owner just shrugged, said, "Tell her you're staying with friends." I smiled and said I couldn't, that she'd come looking if I didn't go home right away. I tried to keep my voice steady. I edged toward the door, said I had to leave. My parents would be angry. Alex watched me, frowning a little. The others muttered something to each other, but nobody tried to grab me. I kept my eyes down, heart pounding. I thanked them for the invite, said maybe another time, and pulled the door open fast. I walked out into the hallway, kept moving, didn't look back. Alex followed me out, walking too close. He tried to make small talk again, like nothing was wrong, but I barely heard him. As we reached the street, he started asking questions again. What bus I was taking, if I always went this way, what stop was mine. I lied, said I lived far from here, that my brother was waiting. He kept pressing, asking for my address, acting like he was worried I'd get lost. I pointed at a random intersection and said my dad would pick me up there. He stared for a second, then nodded slowly. At the bus stop, I kept my back to the wall, holding my phone like I was about to call someone. Alex stood nearby, arms crossed, still watching. The street was empty except for a couple of cars rolling by. He asked again if I wanted to wait inside, if I was sure my parents were coming. I lied and said my brother just texted. He was a block away. A bus rolled up, not my line, but I stepped forward, waved at the driver, and got on without looking back. Alex stayed on the sidewalk, his face unreadable. I found a seat in the back, pulled my hood up, and watched out the window. I kept checking behind me, making sure nobody got on after me. At every stop, I looked for anyone who might be following. I rode past my neighborhood, past my street, taking the longest route I could think of. I finally got off in a busy area, waited in a store for 20 minutes, then caught another bus home. All the way, I felt eyes on me, even though I was alone. When I finally made it home, I locked the door, checked the windows, and turned my phone off. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I kept replaying everything. I realized that nothing about the night was normal. The men were too old, their questions too personal. There was no party, just a plan. They wanted to know who would miss me, if anyone was waiting at home. If I had stayed, I don't think I would have left that apartment again. Now, years later, I'm sure what almost happened. They wanted someone who wouldn't be missed right away, someone they could control. The way they watched me, blocked the door, pressured me to stay. It all fits what I've read about trafficking setups. Sometimes I wonder how many others they tried it on. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't lied, if I hadn't run. I never saw Alex again. I changed my route, kept my head down, and never trusted a stranger on the bus after that. I think about it every time I see someone riding home alone, looking at their phone, not realizing how quickly a normal night can turn into something you remember for the rest of your life. When I was in college, I started doing these late-night drives on the empty back roads outside of town. It wasn't anything wild. I just found it helped me clear my head when I was stressed or pissed off after a long day. The quiet made it easier to think, and the winding roads outside campus felt 100 miles away from everything. I'd blast some music, put the windows down, and just let my mind wander. I got into the habit after freshman year, when stuff with school and roommates was getting to be a lot, and it worked for me. No matter how bad my mood was, those drives would take the edge off. So it became my thing whenever I felt the pressure getting high. This one night in March, I had a huge exam coming up and couldn't sit still in my room. My roommate was up late gaming with friends and being loud, and I just needed some time alone to sort out my thoughts. It was already almost midnight, but I grabbed my keys and decided to take my usual route out toward the old nature preserve. There's this winding mountain road I'd been down maybe a dozen times before. Nothing fancy, just a stretch of blacktop surrounded by woods and fields. At night, it's totally dead. No houses for miles, barely any lights except for the occasional mailbox reflector. I liked it that way. If there were any cars, they were few and far between, usually just other students heading home from somewhere. I didn't pack much, just my phone, wallet, and a half-empty bottle of water. I tossed them in the cup holder, pulled on a hoodie, and went down to the parking lot behind my dorm. It was colder than I expected, the kind of cold that sticks to the inside of your sleeves and makes your hands ache on the steering wheel. The car started up with a grumble, and I sat there for a second, staring at the lit-up dashboard, feeling tired but restless. I reversed out slow, letting the radio fill the cabin, and eased onto the main road heading west. Campus faded away behind me in less than 10 minutes. The streetlights stopped, and it was just my headlights cutting through the dark, bouncing off the thin mist that hung over the fields. I knew the road by heart, past the old gas station, over a narrow bridge, then the sharp curve near the abandoned fruit stand. The preserve was about 20 minutes out, but the drive felt shorter at night. I kept one eye on the clock, mostly out of habit, not wanting to stay out too late and mess up my sleep for the exam. Some nights, I'd see deer along the shoulders, or an occasional raccoon darting out of the brush, but that night was especially quiet. No animals, no cars in my rear view, just the steady hum of the engine. The only sound came from the tires on the damp pavement and the soft static of the radio. I kept my window cracked, the cold air making me shiver, but it helped keep me awake and focused. I could smell the wet leaves and earth from the woods on either side. As I got further out, I noticed more fallen branches in the road than usual, probably from that big storm a few days back. I slowed down to avoid them, weaving a little. A couple times I caught myself zoning out, watching the shadows between the trees flicker and move in the high beams. The sense of isolation was deeper than usual, with no sign of life anywhere. And for a second, I wondered if I should just head back. But I shook it off. I just needed to clear my head, and the preserve was the perfect spot for it. It wasn't long before I reached the part where the road got narrower and started to climb, with old wooden guardrails and sharp drop-offs on one side. There was a small parking lot for the preserve at the top, but I almost never saw anyone park there after dark. I kept going, watching the lines on the road and feeling a little more awake as the curves got tighter. About halfway there, just past a bend where the woods grew thick and close to the road, I saw something blocking the way up ahead. I slowed to a crawl and flicked my high beams on. A huge tree had fallen across both lanes, probably snapped by the storm. The trunk was thick, covered in wet moss, and branches stuck out at awkward angles. I stopped a few yards back and just sat for a second, sizing it up. There was no way around it. The ditch on either side was deep and muddy, and the tree was way too big for me to move alone. I put the car in reverse, craning my neck to look behind. The road was narrow, barely wide enough for two cars to pass, and bordered by soggy grass and soft dirt. I tried to do a careful three-point turn, but the shoulder was even softer than it looked. The back tires spun as soon as they hit the edge, sending up a spray of mud. I let off the gas, hoping they'd catch, but the more I tapped the pedal, the deeper the wheels seemed to sink. I cursed under my breath and rolled down the window, listening for anything. Another car, an animal, maybe even a branch cracking somewhere out in the dark. Nothing. I tried again, shifting from drive to reverse, rocking the car gently, hoping it would free itself. But all I got was more spinning and a loud sucking noise from the mud. My headlights lit up the tree ahead, branches still dripping from the storm, the wet bark shining. For a minute, I just sat there, gripping the wheel, feeling the cold settling into my legs. I checked my phone. No bars. That wasn't a surprise. There's barely any service that far out. I held the phone up by the window anyway, moving it around just in case. The screen stayed empty. I looked at the clock. It was almost 12:45 a.m. There was no way anyone would be driving out this way at that hour, not with the road blocked. I shut off the engine to save gas and listened to the ticking of the cooling metal. I could hear the distant sound of water running somewhere in the woods, maybe a creek swollen from the rain. I got out and checked around the car. The ground was soft and spongy, my shoes sinking half an inch with every step. Mud clung to my soles. I walked to the back and tried to push the car, but it didn't budge. My hands slipped on the damp metal, and my breath made small clouds in the cold air. I circled the car, scanning the tree line and the road, but there was nothing except for the wet smell of earth and the soft drizzle still falling from the branches overhead. I felt the mud pulling at my feet with every step, and I knew the car wasn't going anywhere. I got back in and tried the engine once more, hoping maybe a bit of luck would get me out. The tires spun and dug in deeper. Now I was stuck, completely alone, with no cell service, and no chance of anyone else coming down that road tonight. I let my head rest against the steering wheel and listened to the ticking of the engine, the soft tap of rain on the roof, and realized I had no choice but to wait or walk. After sitting in the dark for what felt like forever, I finally found a single bar of service when I held my phone out the window at just the right angle. The signal kept dropping in and out, but after a few tries, I managed to call for a tow truck. The guy on the other end sounded half asleep, but told me they could send someone out. He said it would take at least 90 minutes, probably longer, because I was so far out from the main highway, and there were still some downed trees on the back roads from the storm. I gave him as much detail as I could about my location, hung up, and checked my battery. It was low, but I figured I could make it last if I kept the screen off. I put the phone in my pocket, locked all the doors, and leaned my seat back, trying to get comfortable. There was nothing to do but wait. The silence felt heavier now, broken up only by the occasional tick of the cooling engine and the patter of drizzle on the roof. At first, I scrolled through some old texts and notes, but I kept glancing up, checking the mirrors, listening for anything out of place. Eventually, the stress and exhaustion must have caught up with me. I dozed off, my body still tense, and my mind drifting between shallow dreams and half-awake anxiety. A noise pulled me out of sleep. It was something scraping and tapping against the side of the car. I shot up straight, blinking at the darkness. At first, I thought it might be a branch or some debris caught by the wind, but the sound was too regular, too close. I held my breath and tried to listen. That's when I saw shapes moving past the headlights. Pale, quick shadows slipping between the puddles on the road. I leaned over the steering wheel, squinting, and finally made out a small herd of wild goats. Their shaggy white coats stood out in the beams, and I could see their horns glinting as they picked at the wet grass along the shoulder. I'd seen these goats during the day before. They were common enough out here, usually skittish but harmless. I watched them for a while, relieved it was just animals and not something worse. Some of them got close enough that I could see the steam rising from their backs in the cold air. I relaxed a little and tried not to make any sudden movements that would scare them off. The goats didn't seem bothered by the car at all, moving quietly around me in the darkness, their hooves making soft clicks on the pavement. Then, out of nowhere, every single goat stopped eating at the exact same moment. Heads up, ears turned forward, bodies stiff as statues. I froze, holding my breath. One by one, they all turned to look in the same direction, toward a thick stand of bushes on the far side of the road. For several long seconds, nothing happened. The goats didn't move, didn't even twitch. It was like they were waiting for something. I pressed myself lower in my seat, instinctively reaching for the door lock again, though it was already down. Suddenly, the whole herd bolted. No warning, no noise, just a wild scramble as they tore off the shoulder and disappeared into the woods. Hooves thudding on mud, bodies vanishing between trees. Not a single goat looked back. I stared after them, my heart pounding. I'd never seen animals react like that, not unless there was a serious threat nearby. A mountain lion, maybe, or something else that made them panic. The stillness that followed was total. The only sound was my own shaky breathing. I reached up and switched off the interior lights, not wanting to draw any more attention. I sat in total darkness, trying not to move, peering out at the roadside. I couldn't see anything through the windows but blackness and the glint of wet leaves in the distant beam of my headlights. The feeling that something was watching me from the trees was suddenly overwhelming. I kept thinking about the way the goats had stared, how they'd all focused on that one patch of darkness, how fast they'd run. Time crawled by after that. I kept checking my phone, watching the battery percentage drop, hoping for the tow truck's lights. I didn't see or hear anything else, but I couldn't shake the sense that I wasn't really alone out there. I gripped my keys and tried to slow my breathing, counting the minutes and trying to convince myself that it was nothing. Just animals being weird. Maybe a coyote. Maybe nothing at all. But the way the goats had acted made it hard to believe that. Eventually, a distant glow appeared through the trees. Headlights, winding their way up the road, getting closer. I sat up, relief flooding over me, and watched as the tow truck's beams lit up the branches and finally swept over my car. I scrambled to unlock the door and stepped out, waving both arms. The driver pulled up alongside me, an older guy with a tired face and a heavy jacket. He didn't ask many questions, just nodded as I pointed to the tree blocking the road and started hooking up the car. I kept glancing over my shoulder at the bushes where the goats had stared, but everything was still and silent. The tow truck's engine was loud in the quiet, drowning out any other sounds. Once my car was free and back on solid ground, the driver gestured for me to climb in the cab with him. I got in fast, shut the door, and tried to keep my eyes forward, focusing on the dashboard lights and the heater blasting against my cold hands. As we started to pull away, I looked back one last time through the passenger side mirror. Just for a second, I caught the silhouette of a person stepping out from the exact spot where the goats had stared. The edge of the bushes, right at the side of the road. The figure was tall, still, and stood right in the center of the lane, watching us drive away. I couldn't make out any details, just a dark shape, hands at their sides, motionless in the glare of the taillights. We rounded the curve and the person vanished from view. My stomach dropped. I didn't say anything to the driver. I didn't want to talk about it. Didn't want to even think about what would have happened if I'd decided to get out and walk, or if I hadn't locked my doors. The whole ride back, I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see that figure following us in the darkness. I never took another night drive out there again. Even now, I think about the way the goats scattered, the silence after, and the shape standing alone in the road, watching as we disappeared into the trees. When I was 25, I got my dream job at a tech company and moved halfway across the country for it. I felt like I was finally getting my life together after a few years of bouncing around. The company was big enough to feel busy, but small enough that I still saw a lot of the same faces each day, even if I didn't know everyone by name. My first week was mostly paperwork, orientation, and figuring out the coffee situation. I had a little cubicle on the developer's floor, not far from the windows that overlooked the parking lot and a patchy lawn. Brad was one of the first people I actually talked to outside of HR. He worked in IT security. His office was just down the hall, with a few monitors and a bunch of cords snaking around on his desk. He had that tech guy look: jeans, faded polo, lanyard with too many keys, and a badge clipped to his pocket. He came by my desk to help set up my security clearances. While he typed in my credentials, he made small talk about where I'd moved from and told me which lunch spots were good. He mentioned his family a lot, especially his wife and 2 kids. He showed me pictures on his phone from family vacations. The kids always had food all over their faces. Brad would laugh and tell me which park had the best playgrounds. I mostly nodded along. I thought he was just being nice since I was new and didn't know anyone. He walked me through the company's security protocols in a way that was actually helpful, not like he was bored or annoyed. He explained things slowly, like where to keep my badge, how to sign into the VPN, and who to call if my password stopped working. After a few days, I'd see him in the break room sometimes, grabbing coffee or heating up his lunch. He always smiled and asked how I was settling in. Sometimes he'd drop by my desk with a question about some update or to check if my computer needed a patch installed. It didn't feel weird. He was the IT guy, and he checked in on lots of people. Sometimes we chatted about movies or weather, but it was always brief. I never noticed anything off. As the months went by, I got busier. My team had a lot of deadlines, so most days I just focused on work. Brad was just someone who was around sometimes, never pushy or awkward. He kept up the friendly thing, sometimes bringing up something he'd read about my hometown, or asking if I'd found a decent pizza place yet. It was just office stuff. I figured he did it with everyone. Once in a while, if there was a company event or a department meeting, I'd see Brad chatting with other people, laughing, handing out tech advice. He seemed to fit in. I never thought much about him outside of work. The holiday party in December was held in the big conference room on the first floor. There were twinkly lights around the windows and fake snow in the corners. They set up a bar, a buffet, and pushed the tables to make a dance floor. It was cheesy, but it felt like a real event. I brought my boyfriend Mike, who drove up from my old city to visit me for the weekend. He wore a tie for once, and I could tell he was trying to make a good impression. We danced a little and hung out with my team. I introduced him to people I worked with, including Brad, when he walked by with a plate of food. Brad shook Mike's hand and said, "Hey, glad you could make it up here." He asked Mike if the drive was bad and told him to try the chocolate cake. They made a little small talk, but Brad seemed quieter than usual. He didn't say much, just smiled and then turned away to talk to someone from finance. The rest of the night was normal. Music, bad dancing, company swag, and gift bags. Mike and I left a little after 10, waving goodbye to the group near the elevators. The next Monday, I was at my desk early, sorting through emails. My phone buzzed with a message from Brad. It was longer than usual, a few big paragraphs. He said he wanted to tell me something personal and hoped it wouldn't be too weird. He started talking about the party, how I looked absolutely beautiful, and how seeing me with Mike had made him feel something he hadn't felt in years. He wrote that he'd been thinking about me non-stop since then. He said he didn't want to make me uncomfortable, but couldn't keep it to himself anymore. He talked about how things were hard at home, how his marriage felt empty, and how he'd never met anyone like me. I sat there for a minute just reading it over, not really believing it. Brad had always been friendly, but not in a way that felt like this. I scrolled up and down the message again. He went on about how he couldn't sleep, how he thought about me during meetings, and how he felt alive again since meeting me. My hands felt shaky. I typed out a short reply, telling him I was sorry he was having a rough time, but that I had a boyfriend and he was married. I told him I didn't want any trouble and hoped things would settle down. Brad answered almost right away. He apologized, said he was just dealing with a rough patch at home, and promised not to say anything like that again. He said he respected me and didn't want to make things awkward at work. I told him it was okay, but I wanted to keep things professional from now on. After that, I just sat back in my chair, staring at my monitor, hoping he'd actually mean what he said. The messages didn't stop, and after that first apology, things only got worse. Brad started texting every day, sometimes late at night, saying he couldn't stop thinking about me and that he was falling in love. At first, I just ignored it, but then he'd show up at my desk more than ever, always with some kind of fake IT issue. He'd say he needed to check my computer for a security update or some problem with my logins. If I was away in a meeting or at lunch, he'd find a reason to come by wherever I was, making up something about the Wi-Fi or company devices. It got to where I was watching for him every time I left my chair. Then he started bringing up details about my life he shouldn't have known. One day he joked about my apartment complex, mentioning the coffee shop across the street and how parking could be a pain there. I'd never told him where I lived, but he acted like it was normal to know. He started showing up near my car in the company lot at the end of the day, just running into me as I left. Once, when I tried to avoid him in the break room, he followed me out and muttered that I'd been leading him on by being nice all these months. He was angry, his face red, voice low. That's when he told me, "You know I can see everyone's email here. All your messages. I can see everything you do on the network." He said it like a threat, and I realized there was nothing normal or friendly about him anymore. I started saving every text and email, even the ones that seemed harmless. I wrote down every time he came by my desk, or every time I saw his car parked near my building. I told my manager what was happening, hoping she'd do something before things got worse. She listened, but she looked uncomfortable, like she didn't want to get involved. She said she'd talked to HR and told me to keep her updated. Brad had been with the company for 8 years, and everyone liked him. He was the helpful guy people went to when they couldn't fix their printer or needed to reset a password. HR dragged their feet, saying they'd look into it, but they'd need to talk to more people. While I waited for something to change, Brad started calling me from numbers I didn't know, leaving voicemails about how much he needed to talk. When I blocked him, he just found new numbers. I'd see his car parked down the street from my building on Saturday mornings, or when I took out the trash at night. Once I confronted him in the parking lot and told him he needed to stop, but he just smiled and said I was paranoid. At work, he started dropping hints that he could see what I was working on. "You might want to double-check that file before you send it to the team," he'd say. "You never know who's looking." He started mentioning little mistakes I'd made in my reports, things only someone with access to my files could know. I realized he was threatening my job. If I didn't respond to him, he could ruin me at work. I went to the police and filed a report, but they said there wasn't enough for a criminal case. No direct threats, just harassment. They told me to keep documenting and call them if it got worse. Everything came to a head one night after work, when I found Brad waiting by my car in the parking garage. I saw his shape in the shadows and stopped, but he walked up to me fast, blocking my way. "We need to talk," he said, standing way too close. "We can't keep ignoring what's between us." I told him there was nothing between us, that he needed to leave me alone, but he grabbed my arm hard. I tried to twist away, but his grip just got tighter. His face was blank, eyes wide, not blinking. "You can't just walk away from me. I know everything about you," he said, voice flat and low. My heart was pounding so loud I could barely think. I looked around for someone else, but the garage was almost empty. I pulled hard and finally broke free, running to the stairwell and not stopping until I was on the street. I called the police right away and filed for a restraining order the next morning. I went to HR again, showed them the police report, the texts, everything I'd saved. Suddenly they acted like it was serious, saying they'd review his access and make sure he was disciplined. But by then, I'd already decided to quit. I took some unused vacation days, packed up my apartment, and found a new job in another state within a month. It's been over a year now, and I still check the locks twice every night. Brad still tries to find me online, using fake names and empty profiles. I made all my accounts private and changed my number. Sometimes I'll get a friend request from a random account with no photo and I know it's him. The worst part is knowing that he still works at that company, still has access to people's information, still able to watch whoever he wants. I tried warning a couple of the other women from my old department, but there's only so much I can do from far away. I just hope none of them have to go through what I did. I still look over my shoulder when I'm out alone, and I don't think that will ever really stop. So when I was 20, I was doing a summer internship program in New Orleans. It was my last week before heading back to college, and my group of friends wanted to experience the real nightlife in the French Quarter. We started at some of the more touristy bars on Bourbon Street, places that had big neon signs and crowds of people taking pictures outside. It was hot, muggy, the kind of air that feels sticky after an hour, and all of us were already a little sweaty from walking. We were a mixed group, 2 guys, 3 girls, most of us interns or students, none of us from the city. Tyler was the only one who claimed he knew New Orleans like a local. He had family there, he said, and he'd been a couple times before. After the 3rd round of weak drinks and loud pop music, he leaned in close to us at the bar and said, "You want to see a real New Orleans club? Not this tourist stuff?" He was grinning, kind of tipsy, and kept saying, "Trust me, this is where people really go." I remember thinking he was just trying to impress us. Still, we all agreed and followed him out of the bar. Tyler led us past the crowds, turning off Bourbon Street down a narrow alleyway that was slick with spilled beer and littered with old flyers and empty cups. The sound changed. The music and shouting faded behind us, replaced by our footsteps and the distant noise of a delivery truck. We passed an old iron gate. Then Tyler pointed out a faded sign over a set of stairs leading down. It just said, "Basement." Nothing more. We hesitated, but Tyler just waved us along, saying, "This is it. You'll see. It's safe, I promise." The stairway was chipped, wet from some recent spill, and smelled like old beer and mildew. We went down one by one, Tyler first, the rest of us close behind. At the bottom, a heavy wooden door opened straight into a basement room. The first thing I noticed was how loud the music was, way louder than anywhere else we'd been, but not the kind you could dance to. It was just a deep, thumping bass with a kind of repetitive beat that almost made my teeth shake. The lights were dim, but it wasn't the kind of darkness that hides everything. It was more like the light was pointed away from the center, so you could see everything, but it all felt off. There were maybe 20 people inside, most of them sitting at the edges of the room in mismatched chairs and booths. Most were older men, at least mid-40s or 50s, a few in suits, a couple in worn denim jackets. The smell was thick, sweat, cheap liquor, a hint of something sour, almost chemical. The dance floor was empty. I glanced around and saw maybe 4 women in the whole place. 2 were sitting at the bar, their shoulders hunched, hair pulled up, both with drinks in front of them that they weren't touching. Another girl in a short black dress sat at a booth with an older guy, staring at her phone. The last one was by the bathroom door, biting her nails, looking at the men, never at us. We took a table near the back, trying to act like we belonged. I remember how Tyler kept laughing, probably to hide how out of place he felt. My friend Jasmine kept adjusting her skirt, looking around with a tight smile. The rest of us just kind of watched. The bartender, a big man with a shaved head and a stained apron, came over. He barely looked at us. Tyler ordered a round of beers, and I noticed the bartender only asked to see Tyler's ID, not the rest of ours. When the drinks came, the bottles were room temperature and dusty at the neck. Tyler didn't care. He just handed them out and raised his to toast, but nobody really joined in. As we sat there, the feeling in the room got heavier. The men around the edges of the club didn't talk much, just watched us, and then turned back to their conversations, their faces mostly expressionless. I started noticing little things that felt wrong. One of the women at the bar kept glancing at the door every few seconds, like she was waiting for something. The girl at the booth kept her phone in her lap, but when the man she was with leaned in, she slid it under the table and froze until he turned away. Nobody was dancing, nobody was really enjoying the music, and everyone's eyes kept shifting around, checking who was coming and going. At one point, I saw the bartender walk up to one of the women and lean in close, whispering something that made her flinch. She didn't respond, just nodded and stared into her glass. We ordered drinks and tried to blend in, but I kept noticing weird interactions happening around us. Some of the women looked like they didn't want to be there, but they stayed close to specific men like they weren't allowed to leave. Jasmine started whispering to me that she didn't feel good about this place, that she wanted to go back to the regular bars. Tyler waved her off, saying, "It's just the vibe. It's more chill, don't worry." He was grinning, clearly enjoying being the one who brought us somewhere new, but I saw him glance over his shoulder a few times too. After about an hour, Tyler got up to get another round, and when he came back, he was laughing. He sat down hard, sloshing his beer, and said, "You'll never believe what just happened. Some guy in a cowboy hat just offered me $100 to buy the pretty blonde." He was talking about Jasmine. He thought it was hilarious and just a weird pickup line, but Jasmine's face went white. I didn't think it was funny at all and told him we needed to leave immediately. Tyler argued, but I stood up and grabbed my jacket, telling everyone we were going. My friends thought I was overreacting, but after I insisted, they stood too. a little nervous now. We left the club and went back to the regular tourist areas. Later that night, our group got separated in the crowds on Bourbon Street. The sidewalks were packed with people, and the music from the bars blended together into one steady noise. Tyler and Jasmine drifted off toward another club, and I lost track of the rest of the group somewhere near a souvenir shop. My phone was almost dead, and I couldn't reach anyone. I'd had a few drinks, my feet hurt, and the humidity felt worse than before. After a while of wandering up and down the street, looking for a familiar face, I gave up. It was almost 2 a.m., and I just wanted to get back to the hotel. I went out to the curb in front of one of the bars, where taxis were lined up, waiting for the last of the party crowd. The first car in line was a yellow sedan with a taxi sign on top, so I got in without really thinking about it. The driver was an older guy with a shaved head, wearing a faded polo shirt. He smiled in the rearview mirror and asked where I was staying. I told him the name of our hotel, which was just a few blocks away. He nodded and pulled away from the curb. At first, it felt normal. He made some small talk about how busy the city was during the summer, how crazy Bourbon Street could get. I leaned back, feeling the exhaustion hit me. But after a few minutes, I realized we weren't heading the right direction. Instead of turning onto Canal, we kept driving away from the French Quarter, down streets that got quieter and darker with every block. I sat up and asked, "Hey, aren't we supposed to go the other way?" The driver kept his eyes on the road and said, "There's construction on Canal. This way's faster." I didn't see any traffic or roadwork behind us, and I started feeling uneasy. The lights from the bars and restaurants faded away, replaced by long stretches of empty sidewalk and old brick warehouses. I looked out the window and tried to recognize something, but nothing looked familiar. My stomach tightened, and I checked my phone, but the battery was at 2%, and then it died. I asked again, louder this time, "Can you just take me back to Bourbon Street? This isn't the way." The driver didn't answer. He just kept driving, turning down another deserted road, past rows of chain-link fences and boarded-up windows. After about 15 minutes, I realized we were nowhere near downtown or my hotel. I started to panic. I tried to open the window, but it wouldn't go down. I demanded, "Let me out right now. Take me back." The driver didn't say a word. He stared straight ahead, gripping the wheel tight, and then turned into a side street lined with warehouses. He slowed down as we approached a big metal building with faded paint and graffiti on the side. There were no lights, just the headlights of the taxi shining on a loading dock. He stopped the car, and I saw several men come out from the shadows of the loading dock. They were all looking at the taxi. One of them pointed in our direction, and they started walking toward us. I realized this was planned, and that I was in real danger. My hands were shaking as I grabbed the door handle. The driver reached to lock the doors, but I managed to pull up the lock first. I shoved the door open and jumped out of the taxi before it came to a complete stop. I hit the pavement hard, my knees and elbows scraped open, my ankle twisting under me, but I forced myself to get up and start running. The men shouted something behind me. I heard footsteps pounding on the concrete, but I didn't look back. I just kept running, dodging piles of trash and broken glass in the street. My heart hammered so loud I could barely breathe. The buildings were mostly empty, their windows covered in metal grates. But I kept running, turning corners, searching for any sign of life. At one intersection, I saw the lights of a small grocery store glowing through the darkness. I made for it, crossing the street without looking for cars. I stumbled inside the store, nearly crashing into a display of chips by the door. There was an elderly woman behind the register, watching a small TV. She looked up, saw me bleeding and out of breath, and immediately came around the counter. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice shaky but kind. I could barely speak. I just said, "Please, can you help me? I need a cab. A real one." She nodded and led me behind the counter, pulling out a first aid kit. She let me clean up in the small employee bathroom while she called a legitimate taxi company. My hands shook as I rinsed the blood from my knees and elbows, but I listened to her voice in the next room, calm and steady as she gave the dispatcher my location and told them to send only a licensed driver with proper identification. She made me sit on a stool behind the counter while we waited. She checked on me every few minutes, offering me water and paper towels. She kept the phone line open with the cab company until the driver arrived. When the taxi finally pulled up outside, she walked me out herself, making sure the driver showed his ID and the official city license. She opened the door for me and told the driver where to take me, and then made sure I was safe inside before she went back into the store. I never reported what happened. I was scared and embarrassed, and I just wanted to get home. I didn't tell my friends the details, only that I'd gotten lost and taken a cab back late. I kept the story to myself, but I know how close I came to disappearing that night. Now, whenever I hear people talk about human trafficking or stories of missing tourists, I think about that basement club and the warehouse and the look on the men's faces as they walk toward the car. It's not something that only happens to people from far away or to runaways. It can happen to any young woman who finds herself alone in the wrong place at the wrong time. After that, I never went out by myself in an unfamiliar city again. I've been hunting in the same patch of Louisiana swampland since I was 12 years old with my grandfather. It's dense, marshy terrain that becomes almost impassable during half the year when the water levels rise. The paths disappear under standing water, and you get thick tangles of cypress roots and black mud that will suck the boots right off your feet. Still, there are spots in those woods where I feel at home, and my favorite has always been the old hunting blind my granddad built out of scrap wood and tin. He put it up before I was born, and even now it sits about 10 feet above the marsh on thick, weathered stilts. Last October, with deer season just starting, I figured it was time to get back out there. I woke up around 3 in the morning, loaded up my old Ford pickup with my rifle and pack, and started the drive out. The radio barely worked, so it was just the sound of the tires humming and the dark fields rushing past my window. The last stretch was always rough, a dirt road full of potholes and roots. When I finally parked at the trailhead, it was still pitch black, just a thin crescent of moon above the trees. I strapped on my headlamp and started the mile-long hike to the blind, cutting through tall grass and palmetto thickets. My boots splashed through muddy water in some spots, but I kept a steady pace. I'd done this walk more times than I could count. When the sun finally started to lighten the sky, I made it to the blind. I climbed up the ladder, set my gear down, and settled in. The air was thick and damp, heavy with the smell of decaying leaves and stagnant water. I remember thinking how still everything was. Usually by dawn you'd hear birds starting up. Herons, woodpeckers, sometimes the weird croak of a bullfrog. That morning, though, there was nothing. No birds, no squirrels rustling in the brush, not even the buzzing of mosquitoes. It felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain, like the forest itself was holding back, waiting for something to happen. I checked my rifle, chambered a round, and propped it across my lap. The clearing below the blind was just visible in the gray light, and I watched for any sign of movement. The stillness pressed in on me. I tried to shake it off, thinking maybe a cold snap had driven the animals deeper into the woods. I took out my thermos, poured some coffee, and sat listening to the wind moving through the tops of the trees. Even the wind seemed quieter than usual, just a soft sigh instead of the usual rustle. I kept scanning the tree line with my binoculars, but everything stayed the same. The water in the marsh was perfectly still, Not a ripple. I couldn't even see insects moving on the surface. I told myself it was nothing, just a slow morning. But I kept catching myself looking over my shoulder, checking the shadows under the blind and out in the brush. The hair on the back of my neck was standing up, and I couldn't figure out why. A couple hours passed. I watched the clearing, watched the trees, but not a single deer showed up. Normally, I'd see at least some movement by then. Rabbits, a fox, maybe a raccoon rooting around. But the whole place was dead quiet. The only sound was my own breathing and the occasional creak of the old wooden platform. I tried fiddling with the straps on my pack, rearranging things just to keep my hands busy. But that strange feeling didn't go away. I felt like I was being watched. But every time I glassed the tree line, all I saw was moss and shadows. The sun rose higher, pushing beams of light through the branches, but it didn't warm up much. I kept waiting for something to break the silence, but nothing came. I started to get a headache from the tension. Around noon, I ate a sandwich and checked my phone, but there was no signal out there. I almost called it quits then, but stubbornness kept me sitting, hoping the animals would come out once it warmed up. By late afternoon, I still hadn't seen a single living thing. No birds in the sky, no tracks in the mud below the blind, nothing. The silence started to make my skin crawl. I shifted in my seat, tried to focus on anything but that gnawing feeling in my gut. I kept glancing back the way I'd come, half expecting to see someone or something standing on the trail. But there was nothing. Just that empty, dead marsh stretching away on all sides. Finally, as the sun started sinking behind the trees, I couldn't take it anymore. I packed up my gear, checked the area one last time with my binoculars, and climbed down from the blind. The sound of my boots on the ladder was loud in the still air. I slung my rifle over my shoulder, double-checked the safety, and started back toward my truck. The walk out felt different than the walk in. The air was heavier, the shadows longer. I kept my head on a swivel, scanning both sides of the trail. My footsteps seemed too loud. Every snap of a twig underfoot made me jump. The woods seemed to close in, the trail winding through tight stands of cypress and palmetto. I kept looking over my shoulder, half convinced I'd see someone following me. But every time I stopped to listen, all I heard was my own breathing. By the time I saw the glint of my truck through the trees, my nerves were shot. I reached for my keys, hands shaking a little, and unlocked the door. I loaded my gear into the back seat and got in, locking the doors behind me. Only then did I finally let myself breathe easy. But even as I sat there, staring at the empty trailhead, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in those woods. I drove home that night thinking it was just a wasted day, nothing more. I cleaned my gear, set my boots out to dry, and tried to shrug off the uneasy feeling that had been clinging to me all afternoon. Before bed, I set my alarm for even earlier, hoping the second day would be different. At sunrise, I was already back at the trailhead, the truck still damp from morning dew. The air felt cooler, heavy with fog hanging over the marsh, but the woods were still dead quiet. Not even the insects were moving. I walked the same mile-long trail, checking my rifle and keeping an eye on the tree line. Halfway down the path, I saw something that made me stop cold. Fresh animal tracks, big, clean, and unmistakable, pressed into the mud where the trail dipped low near the cypress roots. I crouched to get a better look. The prints were huge, bigger than my hand, with a rounded shape and clear indentations where the pads pressed deep into the wet ground. 4 toes, no claws showing, mountain lion for sure. The tracks were new, maybe just a few hours old, made since the last rain. As I followed the line of prints, my stomach twisted. They overlapped my own boot tracks from the night before, shadowing every step I'd taken out of the woods. I looked ahead and behind, noticing how the big cat's paws matched my own prints, pacing me exactly. The realization hit hard. The lion had been following me, probably watching from just out of sight. It must have moved in after I'd passed through, trailing me all the way back to the truck and then vanishing into the brush before dawn. I started tracing my route back to the blind, watching how the animal's tracks came and went, sometimes right on top of my own. Here and there, the prints veered off into the grass, circled a tree, or stopped at the edge of the trail. At one muddy bend, the tracks pressed deep beside a pile of flattened reeds, as if the animal had paused to rest. Nearby, I spotted gouges raked into the bark of a small gum tree, about as high as my shoulder. The scratches were fresh, sap still oozing from the cuts, and they were spaced wide, signs of a mature cat marking its territory. I looked up and saw more of those claw marks further down the path, each one clean and deliberate. Moving closer to the old blind, I noticed another spot where the grass and leaves had been pressed flat in a tight oval. I recognized the sign right away. This was where the cat had lain down, likely for hours, with a clear view of the stand. From here, it could watch the clearing, the ladder, even the shadow where I'd left my backpack. The tracks circled this spot, looping out toward the brush and then returning again and again. Every detail pointed to the same thing. While I'd been sitting above, scanning the empty woods for deer, the mountain lion had been studying me just as carefully from below. The weight of that realization settled in. All those hours spent listening to the silence, scanning for movement, trying to spot a deer in the clearing. Meanwhile, a predator had been closing in, waiting for a weakness or a mistake. The forest hadn't gone quiet for no reason. Every animal that could escape had either run or hidden, leaving only the hunter and the hunted. I thought about how many times I'd climbed down that ladder, how exposed I must have looked from the edge of the tree line. It didn't matter how careful I was or how many times I checked my surroundings. The cat had all the advantages. Standing there in the brush, surrounded by clawed trees and fresh prints, I felt exposed in a way I never had before. I stopped tracking, backed away from the resting spot, and started moving back toward my truck with a steady pace. The forest stayed silent as I hiked out, eyes scanning every shadow, ears straining for even a hint of movement. I kept my rifle ready, but it felt small compared to what I knew was out there, hidden just beyond the edges of my sight. I made it back to the truck without seeing another living thing. Only when the door was locked and the engine started did I let myself breathe normally again. At home, I spent the rest of the day reading everything I could about mountain lion behavior, searching for anything that matched what I'd experienced. What I found made my skin crawl. A drought had hammered the region all summer, wiping out most of the deer and driving big predators out of their usual territories. The experts all said the same thing. When a lion starts following people, watching them for hours, it's testing boundaries, thinking about the risks of a hunt. Hunger makes them bold, and a person alone in the woods, distracted and unprepared, is sometimes all it takes. I replayed every step of the last 2 days, realizing how close I'd come to never making it back. If I'd stayed a little later in the blind, or if I'd decided to camp overnight, I might have given the cat its chance. A lot of people think of predators as distant threats, something you'll never see if you're careful. The truth is, you don't see them unless they want you to. That lesson sticks with me every time I think about going back. Now, if I hunt, I bring someone with me, and I carry bear spray clipped right to my belt. Every time the woods get too quiet, I remember how luck and timing are sometimes the only things keeping you alive. I've never gone back to that blind alone.